Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Zombies of New Orleans. The moment I stepped off the bus in New Orleans, I could feel it, something different, something not quite right. The air was thick with the scent of spices, damp earth, and a hint of decay. It was an intoxicating blend, one that pulled me in, despite the unease it stirred deep in my gut. The city was alive, buzzing with energy. I could hear the faint sound of jazz drifting through the streets, blending with the laughter of people enjoying the warm, humid evening. But there was something else too, something that lingered just beneath the surface, like a whisper at the back of your mind. I had always dreamed of visiting New Orleans. It had a reputation for mystery, for its rich culture, for its festivals and food, for its ghosts and voodoo. It was the kind of place where every corner held a story, where the streets seemed to hold centuries of secrets. I had arrived alone, looking for adventure, hoping to get lost in the city's energy. But the moment I arrived, I felt as though the city itself was watching me, studying me, waiting. I wandered through the French Quarter, taking in the colorful buildings, the intricate ironwork of the balconies, the cobblestone streets that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The sounds of the street performers echoed through the air, competing with the distant clang of the trolley. Tourists and locals alike milled about, their faces lit up by the golden glow of the streetlights. But beneath the charm, there was a heaviness. Something about the way the shadows stretched across the narrow alleys, or the way the streetlights flickered just a bit too often, set me on edge. It wasn't the typical kind of fear, this was something deeper, something I couldn't shake. I met a few locals at a bar, an old dive tucked away in a corner of the quarter. The conversation flowed easily, as it often does with strangers in new places. The bartender, a tall man with withered skin and sharp eyes, mentioned the cemetery in passing. Some folks say it's haunted, he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. I wouldn't go near it at night if I were you. I raised an eyebrow. A cemetery? Not just any cemetery, he continued. The St. Louis Cemetery, one of the oldest in the country. Some say it's cursed, that the dead don't rest easy there. Strange things happen, at night especially. People have gone missing, seen things they couldn't explain. It's better to just stay away. I chuckled, trying to brush off the warning as a local superstition. You believe in ghosts? He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You'll see for yourself soon enough. As the night wore on, the unease in my chest grew. I had no intention of going near the cemetery, at least not yet. But I couldn't help the nagging feeling that something was waiting for me, just out of sight, in the shadows of the city. It was the kind of feeling that lingered even after I'd left the bar and started walking back to my hotel. The city was alive, but there was something darker pulsing just under the surface, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was pulling me toward the cemetery. The night was growing late when I stumbled into another bar, a cozy, dimly lit spot near the edge of the quarter, tucked between two narrow streets. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood and whiskey, the sounds of conversation muffled by the soft jazz playing in the background. It was quieter than the first place, the kind of bar where the locals gathered after work, where they leaned in close and spoke in hushed tones. I slid onto a bar stool and ordered a drink. The bartender, a woman with a heavy southern drawl, giving me a polite but detached smile as she poured me a glass of bourbon. I glanced around, trying to soak in the atmosphere. The people here were different. There was a certain heaviness to the air, a weight in the room that I couldn't quite place. At the far end of the bar, an elderly man sat alone, his weathered face obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were old-fashioned, the fabric faded from years of wear. He had the kind of face that looked as if it had seen a lifetime's worth of trouble. His fingers were long and thin, stained yellow from years of smoking, and he twirled an old silver pocket watch absent-mindedly. I felt a pull, a curiosity that I couldn't ignore, and decided to approach. As I neared, the man looked up from his watch, his eyes sharp despite his age. They were the kind of eyes that saw more than they let on, the kind that made you feel like he could look right through you. "Evening, stranger," he said in a gravelly voice, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "What brings you to this corner of the world?" I smiled, trying to appear casual. "Just passing through. Figured I'd take in the sights, get a feel for the city." He nodded slowly, his lips curling into a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, New Orleans, she's got a way of pulling people in. But not everyone makes it out, you know." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his tone. "I'm just here for a good time, not looking to stay too long." The old man chuckled softly, a sound that was almost more of a rasp. "Most people say that. But the city has a way of sticking to you. It's like the ghosts here. They don't just haunt the places, they haunt the people too." I was starting to get a sense of where this was going. "Ghosts, huh? I've heard the stories." "Oh, it's not just ghosts," he said, his voice dropping lower as if sharing a secret. "It's worse than that. It's the dead that rise. The cemetery. St. Louis Cemetery. You've heard of it, I'm sure?" I nodded, the name familiar from the brief mention earlier at the other bar. "Yeah, I've heard people talk about it." The man leaned in closer, his breath stale with the scent of tobacco and whiskey. "You shouldn't go near it, not after dark. People who go there, they don't come back. And it's not just because of the dead. There's something else, something much worse." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean, something worse?" His eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling intensity. "It's the rituals. The locals, they practice them to keep the dead from taking over the city. But sometimes, they fail. Sometimes, the dead don't stay dead. And when that happens, things get ugly. Real ugly." I laughed, trying to ease the tension in the air. "That sounds like one of those urban legends. You know, the kind that gets passed around at Halloween." The man didn't laugh with me. Instead, he looked me square in the eye and said, "You think it's all just stories? You wait. You'll see for yourself. You'll understand when it's too late." I couldn't tell if he was crazy or if he knew something I didn't, but I wasn't about to stick around for a lecture on supernatural folklore. I forced a smile and stood up, tossing a few bills on the counter. "Thanks for the drink," I said, trying to sound casual. "But I'm sure it's just superstition." The man didn't respond immediately. He just watched me, his eyes narrowing as I turned to leave. Before I reached the door, I heard him mutter, barely loud enough to catch, "Remember, stranger. The city never forgets." I shook it off as just another eccentric local, one of those characters who thrive in a city like New Orleans. After all, people like him were always full of stories. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I certainly didn't believe in zombies. But something about the way he said it, something about the intensity in his eyes, lingered in my mind as I stepped out into the night. The next day, the sun was high, and the city was alive with tourists and locals alike, moving through the streets like a well-choreographed dance. Yet, the weight from last night's conversation with the old man still clung to me, his words echoing in the back of my mind. I pushed the thoughts aside, deciding to explore more of the city. After all, I was here to experience New Orleans in all its splendor, and I wasn't about to let some superstitions ruin my fun. I wandered deeper into the heart of the city, eventually finding myself on the edge of the French Quarter. The path was lined with trees, their branches hanging low, creating a canopy that shielded the sun. It was quiet here, almost too quiet, a stark contrast to the lively streets just a few blocks away. As I rounded a corner, I came upon an iron gate, ornate and weathered with age. Behind it lay a cemetery, its gravestones scattered like broken teeth across the uneven ground. The St. Louis Cemetery. I knew the name well. How could I not? It was famous, after all, one of the oldest cemeteries in the country. And, as the locals had whispered, it was a place shrouded in mystery. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound of rusted hinges slicing through the heavy silence. I stepped inside, immediately feeling a shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick, almost suffocating. There was no breeze here, no sense of movement, as if the world had simply stopped beyond the cemetery walls. The place was beautiful in its decay. The tombs were old, some crumbling, others meticulously maintained, the names on the stones faded by time. There was a peculiar stillness to it, as though the dead were watching, waiting for something or someone. I found myself walking along the narrow stone paths, my footsteps muffled by the grass and overgrown ivy that had crept through the cracks. The further I went into the cemetery, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The sun, once bright, now felt distant, like a dim bulb struggling to push its light through a clouded sky. The gravestones towered over me in strange, jagged shapes, some leaning, others stacked atop one another in odd, uneven formations. The crypts were carved with symbols I couldn't recognize, some jagged, others intricate, but all of them unsettling in their complexity. I paused at one of the larger tombs, its stone door slightly ajar. I could almost feel a presence there, an energy that hummed just beneath the surface of the earth. It made my skin crawl, and I shivered despite the warmth of the day. Something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the longer I stood there, the more my stomach twisted with unease. It was the stillness, the way the place seemed almost too quiet, too perfect. It didn't feel like a cemetery. It felt like a waiting room, like the dead weren't truly gone, but rather lying in wait for something or someone to awaken them. I continued to wander, drawn inexplicably further into the cemetery, each step feeling heavier than the last. I found myself at the edge of a forgotten section, where the tombs were even more decayed, overgrown with vines and moss. The stones here were cracked and broken, some entirely toppled, revealing what seemed to be long-forgotten graves. A chill swept through the air, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning quickly, I saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground, their branches swaying ever so slightly. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling as nerves, but something inside me was starting to stir. Something dark. The further I went, the stronger the feeling became, until I was standing in front of a particularly old crypt, its door wide open. Inside, the darkness seemed to pulse, as if the shadows themselves were alive, moving with a strange rhythm. I couldn't see what was inside, but I felt something. A breath that didn't belong to the wind. A weight that pressed down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I took a step back, the hairs on my neck standing on end. My heart was racing now, my body reacting instinctively to the sense of danger that was growing sharper by the second. The crypt's mouth seemed to open wider, inviting me in, beckoning me with an invisible hand. I turned to leave, my legs suddenly heavy as though the very ground beneath me was trying to hold me in place. I couldn't explain it. I had to get out of there. As I made my way back toward the gate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something in the cemetery was moving just out of sight, watching my every step. When I finally reached the gate and stepped outside, I took a deep breath, as if I had just escaped something suffocating. The noise of the city was a relief, the familiar sounds of traffic, people, and music flooding my senses. I glanced back at the cemetery, half expecting to see something, anything, moving behind the wrought iron gates. But it was still. Silent. And yet, that feeling lingered. Something in the air. Something dark. And somehow, I knew it wasn't over. The city had only just begun to show me its true face. The sun had set, and New Orleans had transformed. The city's vibrant energy shifted with the darkness, the air cooler but filled with an electric anticipation. The streets were alive with music and laughter, but there was a subtle shift, a deeper sense of mystery that seemed to blanket the city once the sun disappeared behind the horizon. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me back to the cemetery, an inexplicable curiosity gnawing at my insides. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but the pull was too strong. Something in that place had unsettled me, and I needed to know more. So, that night, after the city had quieted down a bit, I found myself standing once again at the gates of St. Louis Cemetery. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and the faint trace of incense. It wasn't the same peaceful quiet from earlier that day. This time, it felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. As I pushed the gate open, it creaked louder than before, the sound echoing in the still night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie, pale light over the gravestones. The shadows of the tombs stretched long across the ground, their jagged edges like dark fingers reaching for the earth. Everything seemed unchanged, yet different. The cemetery felt more alive now, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stepped carefully through the uneven paths, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. But the silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of the day. It was tense. And as I walked deeper, I began to hear it, a soft rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against stone. But no one was there. I paused, straining to hear. The noise came again, this time closer. My heart skipped a beat as I turned, expecting to see someone, some passerby, but there was nothing. Just shadows. A chill ran down my spine, and I took another step forward, my eyes scanning the cemetery. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. I felt it more than I saw it, just the slightest shift in the air, the sense of movement that didn't belong. Then, I saw it. At the far edge of the cemetery, near the old crypt I had passed earlier, a shadow flickered. It wasn't the shape of a person, but something else, something unnatural, shifting like smoke in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to look away. The shadow moved again, and this time I saw it more clearly, a tall, thin figure, hunched over in a way that was wrong, its limbs too long, too unnatural. It moved with a jerking, lurching motion, as if it couldn't quite control its own body. It was like watching a puppet being pulled by strings, the movement stiff and erratic. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. What was that thing? What was happening here? Suddenly, there was another sound, like a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere near the crypt. My eyes darted in its direction, and my breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the shadows, I could make out another shape, smaller but equally disturbing. It moved on all fours, its body contorting in ways that made my stomach turn. I backed up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I had to leave, that whatever I was seeing, whatever was moving among the graves, was not something I should be here to witness. But before I could turn to run, the ground beneath me shifted. I felt it, an unmistakable tremor, a vibration that came from deep within the earth. My legs nearly buckled, and I stumbled forward, my hand reaching out to steady myself on one of the old gravestones. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tremor from a passing vehicle. It was something else, something alive. A low, eerie moan echoed through the cemetery, rising from the ground itself. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, like the cemetery was breathing, exhaling something that had been dormant for far too long. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The air became still again. The figures, the shadows, the strange noises, all gone. I was left in the oppressive silence, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my skin clammy with sweat. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew what was buried in the earth of this place. I turned quickly and headed for the gate, my steps quickening, my mind racing. I couldn't get out fast enough. The cemetery was not what it appeared to be. It was something darker, something older, and it was alive in a way that defied all reason. As I stepped through the gate and into the relative safety of the street, I glanced back one last time at the cemetery. And in the distance, just beyond the shadows of the graves, I could have sworn I saw a figure watching me. The city was still, the noise of the streets a distant hum in my ears. But the fear that clung to me now was real, and it was growing. There was something in New Orleans that I had only just begun to understand, and something told me it wasn't going to let me leave without showing me its true nature. The following day passed at a blur, the events of the night lingering in my mind like a bad dream I couldn't quite wake up from. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I tried to go about my day, walking the busy streets of New Orleans, but everything felt different now, somehow. The city, with all its charm, now seemed like a stage set for something sinister, something hidden just beneath the surface. By nightfall, the unease had grown into something much deeper. I had intended to stay away from the cemetery, to shake off the paranoia that had gripped me since my last visit. But the pull was irresistible. It was as if something in the cemetery was calling to me, beckoning me to return. I had to know more. So, once again, I found myself standing before the cemetery gates. The streets around me were quiet, the usual bustle of the city faded into the background. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of music or conversation from the French Quarter, just an eerie stillness. The iron gate creaked open, louder this time, as though the cemetery itself was aware of my return. The night felt colder than before, and the moon on high in the sky, its light casting long shadows over the tombstones. The cemetery was just as I remembered it, silent, foreboding, its stones standing like sentinels in the dark. But something felt off, like the air itself was thick with something unspoken, something waiting. I walked deeper into the cemetery, my feet moving almost automatically, my mind racing with the same questions I couldn't stop asking. What had I seen last night? What had moved in the shadows? Was it possible I had imagined it all? Or had I stumbled upon something I was never meant to see? A rustling sound came from somewhere nearby, a soft shuffle of feet against the gravel. My body tensed. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the shadows, stretching and shifting in the moonlight. My heart began to race as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something here, something I couldn't see, but could feel closing in around me. I pressed on, the unease in my chest growing with every step. The cemetery seemed larger at night, the paths twisting in ways that didn't make sense. As I rounded a corner, I caught sight of a figure standing in the distance near one of the older tombs. It was impossible to make out any details, just a silhouette against the darkened sky. I froze. It wasn't the same shape as I had seen the night before, but there was something about it that made my stomach drop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing me, unmoving, like a statue carved from shadow. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs felt heavy, as though the ground beneath me had turned to stone. The figure remained still, watching me. And then, just when I thought I might have imagined it, it moved, slowly, deliberately, taking a step toward me. My heart leapt into my throat. The figure was coming closer. I couldn't look away. My body wanted to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. It wasn't human, I realized. There was something wrong about its shape, the way it moved. It was as if the air around it distorted, like reality itself couldn't quite hold its form. With every step it took, I felt a growing pressure in the air. The sounds of the city, distant and faint, vanished entirely, leaving me in a vacuum of silence. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, thumping louder in my chest with every breath. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The figure was closer now, so close I could make out the faintest details, the twisted, skeletal outline of its limbs, the unnatural angles of its arms. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its gaze on me. It felt like it was reading my thoughts, digging into my very soul. It stopped just a few feet away. For a long moment, it stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I couldn't bring myself to move, to speak. I was trapped in the oppressive presence of whatever this thing was. Then, it did something that made my blood run cold. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. And in that moment, I saw it, just for a split second, beneath the hood, a glimmer of something pale, something dead. Eyes. Hollow and empty, but staring straight into mine. The air around me seemed to tighten, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure reached out, a hand, skeletal, bony, and unnaturally long, extending toward me. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, my body frozen in place by the sheer force of terror. Before the hand could touch me, the figure vanished. One moment, it was there, and the next, it was gone, as if it had never been. The moonlight returned to its normal quiet glow, the cemetery settling back into its eerie stillness. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The feeling of being watched grew stronger than ever, and I realized that I wasn't just afraid of what I had seen, I was afraid of what was still out there, waiting for me. I turned and ran. The ground beneath me seemed to stretch and shift as I sprinted toward the gate, but I couldn't look back. I couldn't stop. Every step felt like I was running away from something I didn't fully understand, but something that was closing in. As I burst through the gates and into the street, I looked back one last time at the cemetery. And there, just beyond the iron bars, I could see it again, a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. I wasn't alone in New Orleans. Not anymore. And whatever was out there, in that cemetery, wasn't going to let me leave so easily. The city was a blur of activity as I moved through the streets of New Orleans the next morning, my mind still caught on the events of the previous night. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being pulled back to the cemetery again and again. I had tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was caught in the grips of paranoia, but deep down, I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And I needed answers. So, when the sun began to dip low in the sky once again, casting long shadows over the city, I found myself walking back toward the cemetery. There was no doubt in my mind that I had to return. If there was something in that place, something dark and unnatural, I had to understand what it was, why it was there, and what it wanted from me. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity anymore. It was personal. The streets had quieted by the time I reached the iron gates of St. Louis Cemetery. The air had a strange weight to it, heavy and still, and as I pushed the gate open, it creaked, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The cemetery stretched out before me, its rows of old tombs and crypts looming like forgotten giants, their surfaces cracked and weathered by time. The moon hung just above the horizon, a thin crescent casting a cold light over the ground. I made my way into the heart of the cemetery, the path before me as winding and confusing as I remembered. The ground was uneven beneath my feet, and the air smelled of damp earth, decay, and something else, something faintly metallic. It was the smell of something old, something that had been buried for far too long. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were fresh disturbances in the soil. Several graves had been partially unearthed, their tombstones leaning at angles, as if someone, or something, had disturbed them recently. The earth around the graves was soft and loose, as if it had been freshly dug. I approached one of the disturbed graves cautiously, my heart racing as I noticed the small knot of dirt that had been pushed aside. The edges of the grave were jagged, the soil clumped and uneven. It looked as though something had been pulled out from beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. The grave wasn't just disturbed, it was opened. I took another step closer, my eyes scanning the ground around me. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no fresh tracks in the dirt, but the sense of unease gnawed at me. What had done this? Why were these graves open now, after all these years? I moved on, feeling the growing sense of dread in my chest. The cemetery felt different today. It wasn't just the physical changes, the broken graves and disturbed earth, but something else, something intangible. The very air felt thick, charged with an unsettling energy. As I reached another row of tombs, I paused, catching movement out of the corner of my eye. It was so subtle at first, just a flicker of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I turned, my eyes scanning the area. There, in the distance, near the back of the cemetery, I saw it again. A figure, this time more distinct than before. The shape of it was humanoid, but the way it stood, unmoving and eerily still, made my stomach churn. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its presence, as if it was watching me. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. Was it the same figure I had seen before? Was it something else? What did it want from me? The figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for me. I couldn't stay here any longer. Something told me that I was getting too close, too deep into the mystery of this place. I turned to leave, my feet quickening as I walked back toward the cemetery's entrance. But as I took a step forward, I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I stopped, my heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was no figure anymore. Nothing. Only the eerie stillness of the cemetery and the wind rustling through the trees. But then, I saw it, a shadow moving across the ground, long and serpentine, shifting beneath the moonlight. It wasn't cast by any tree or crypt. No, this shadow was its own, slithering across the earth as though it had a life of its own. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow stopped near one of the graves, one that was freshly disturbed. I watched in horror as the shadows seemed to shift, morphing into a dark shape that took form. Slowly, impossibly, the ground began to move. The earth trembled beneath my feet, the soil shifting and parting as though something was rising from below. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so loudly I could hardly hear the scraping sound anymore. My eyes were glued to the grave, to the figure that seemed to emerge from the earth. It wasn't human, not in any sense I could understand. It was something far older, far darker. The shape that rose from the soil was skeletal, its limbs stretched long and twisted, as if it had been buried for centuries. Its hollow eyes stared at me, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, the pull of its presence. It was moving toward me, slow and deliberate, its steps sinking into the earth with each movement. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to collapse into the hollow emptiness of that moment, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. I knew then that the cemetery was alive, not in the way I had first imagined, but in a far more terrifying way. Something ancient had been disturbed, something that should have stayed buried. And now, whatever it was coming for me. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the gate far too distant. Behind me, I could feel the presence of whatever had risen from the grave, following me, pursuing me through the darkness. I had to get out. And I had to do it fast. Because whatever it wasn't just watching me anymore. It was hunting me. My legs burned as I ran through the winding paths of the cemetery, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the night, mingling with the rustling of the trees and the occasional distant cry of a night bird. Behind me, I could feel it, the presence, following me, lingering just out of sight. My breath was coming in sharp gasps, my pulse racing, but there was no relief. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But as I approached the gate, I stopped. Something stopped me. The eerie sensation of being watched, the same feeling I had experienced from the moment I set foot in this city, swept over me again. It was impossible to ignore, as though the very air around me had thickened, drawing me back into the cemetery. I turned, heart pounding. I knew I should keep running, but something deeper within me urged me to stay, to understand what was happening. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something more to this, something that would make sense of the chaos spiraling around me. That's why I saw them. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, shadows playing on the gravestones. But no! These were figures, people, moving through the dark, their shapes barely visible under the dim glow of the moonlight. They were gathered near one of the oldest crypts, just off the main path, huddled in a tight circle. I edged closer, curiosity getting the better of me. My pulse thudded in my ears as I crept through the cemetery, moving quietly so as not to draw attention. The group was large, at least 6 or 7 people, all dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially hidden by hoods. I could hear their murmurs, soft whispers that seemed to blend into the rustling of the leaves, but there was something about the tone of their voices, low and urgent, that made my stomach turn. They were performing something. A ritual. It wasn't immediately clear what they were doing, but the air around them felt charged, heavy with a sense of dread. There was a palpable tension, a sort of unease in the atmosphere that made every step I took feel like an intrusion. One of the figures stepped forward, holding something in their hands. I couldn't see it clearly, but it glimmered faintly in the moonlight. A knife, perhaps? Or some kind of artifact? The person's movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were preparing for something monumental, something inevitable. The group chanted in unison, their voices low and rhythmic. The words were foreign to me, impossible to understand, but the tone, the cadence, it felt ancient, like a prayer or a summoning. A part of me wanted to turn and flee, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I had to know what they were doing. As I edged closer, I caught a glimpse of the crypt they were gathered around. It was old, ancient even, its stone cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. The grave it marked was one of the oldest in the cemetery, its inscription barely legible, the name almost worn away by time. The group was gathered around it, their bodies forming a loose circle, each one focusing on the ritual as if it were the most important thing in the world. Then, I heard it. The words I hadn't been able to make out before. A voice, quiet and sharp, broke through the chant. "He's coming," a man whispered, his voice trembling. "The dead are rising." I froze. The words were clear now, unmistakable. I leaned in closer, trying to catch every syllable, my heart thudding in my chest. The dead are rising. We must prepare. The rest of the group didn't stop their chanting. They didn't acknowledge the man's words, but it was as if the words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Rising? What did that mean? Who were they talking about? My breath hitched, and I instinctively took a step back, but I was too late. One of the figures turned sharply, and I froze. For a brief, terrible moment, our eyes locked, his gaze piercing through the darkness. His eyes were cold, empty, and there was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. He wasn't surprised by my presence. No, he had known I was there all along. He stepped forward, his voice steady, but laced with a warning. "You shouldn't be here." The others continued their ritual, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the interaction. But his words felt like a command, a dark order meant to keep me from learning more. Before I could respond or even react, he turned his back and rejoined the group. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, filling the cemetery with a sense of rising tension. The figure with the object, whatever it was, raised it high, and for a moment, the moonlight flashed off it like a blade. The air seemed to thrum with power, thickening around me like something ancient was stirring in the earth. I should have left. My mind screamed for me to turn and run, but I couldn't tear myself away. My legs were locked in place as if the ground itself had a hold on me. What were they doing? And what had they meant by the dead rising? I took a deep breath and tried to back away slowly, moving toward the shadows. The ritual wasn't something I understood, but the gravity of the situation was undeniable. These people, these locals, knew more than they were letting on. The grave, the earth, the presence that lingered in the cemetery, it was all connected. But before I could retreat any further, the air shifted. The ground beneath me trembled ever so slightly, a subtle vibration that seemed to emanate from the very soil of the cemetery itself. The chanting stopped. The figure holding the object lowered it slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. Something was moving beneath the earth. The rest of the group stood motionless, their faces hidden, but I could sense the anticipation in the air. They were waiting for something, waiting for it to rise. I took one last glance at the grave, at the gathering shadows around the crypt, before turning to flee. I had to get out. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I knew it would not be good. As I ran, the whispering voices of the ritual echoed in my mind, the dead are rising. That night, I couldn't sleep. No matter how many times I closed my eyes, the images from the cemetery haunted me, those eerie figures in the darkness, the chanting, the ground shifting as if something beneath it was waking up. My heart raced whenever I dared to close my eyes, but even in the dark, I couldn't escape the sensations. The weight of the place, the cold fingers of dread that seemed to stretch out from the cemetery and latch onto me, clung to my thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But it wasn't peaceful. No, it never was. I found myself standing at the edge of the cemetery again, but everything was different. The sky above me was thick with swirling black clouds, blotting out the moon. The wind howled, and the trees around me bent and groaned, as though the very earth itself was trembling in fear. The air was heavy, suffocating, thick with something I couldn't name. It smelled of earth and decay, but worse, much worse. I didn't know how I had gotten there. My feet were bare, cold against the damp earth, but I didn't feel the chill. In fact, I didn't feel much of anything except the overwhelming sense of something wrong, something so deeply wrong that it cut to the bone. I tried to move, to walk, but it was like wading through thick mud, my feet sinking with every step I took. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, the shadows around me shifted, twisting and stretching in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I looked around, but there was nothing to see. The gravestones were all just dark shapes, feeding into the darkness, and the air was filled with an unnatural silence, as if the world itself had forgotten how to make sound. And then, I heard it. A soft whisper, almost drowned by the wind, but unmistakable. The words were unintelligible at first, but they grew clearer with every passing second, becoming sharper, more distinct. They are not at rest. The voice was low, guttural, as if it came from deep beneath the earth. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned around, scanning the cemetery for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just the darkness, the twisted shadows, and the faint outlines of the gravestones. But then, I saw them. Figures. Moving slowly between the graves, their forms pale and twisted, like shadows given substance. Their bodies were hunched and unnatural, their limbs too long, too thin, like something that had been buried too long, forgotten. The faces that emerged from the dark were blank, featureless, just pale flesh and empty eyes. They moved in slow, jerky motions, their heads tilting unnaturally as though they were studying me, appraising me like prey. They are not at rest. The voice came again, louder now, as if the cemetery itself was speaking to me. I could feel its presence all around me, pressing on my chest, suffocating me. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes locked onto mine. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like they were trapped in the mud, unable to move, stuck in place. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figures were circling me now, inching closer with every breath I took. I could hear the soft scrape of their feet on the ground, the whisper of their movements like the rustling of leaves on a windless night. They are not at rest. The words were louder now, as if they were coming from all around me, reverberating in the very air. The cemetery was alive with the sound of those whispers, an endless chorus that filled my mind, pushing everything else aside. And then, one of them reached out. A cold, skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long, grasping for me. It brushed against my skin, and I recoiled, the touch like ice, like death itself. I wanted to scream, but the air around me was thick, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The figures were closing in, their eyes empty, staring, unblinking, as they surrounded me. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, the air charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. They are not at rest. The voice now filled my mind, drowning out everything else. The cemetery, the figures, the whispers, they all merged into one terrible truth. They were dead. But they weren't at rest. And neither was I. I felt my knees give way beneath me, and I sank to the ground, trembling, unable to move. The figures loomed over me, their hollow eyes boring into my soul, and I knew that they were coming for me. That whatever force had stirred them from their graves was not going to let me leave. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble beneath me. The earth groaned, shifting, as if something was stirring below. The figures stopped, their heads turning toward the source of the disturbance. I could feel it too. Something was rising from the earth, something ancient and powerful, something that had been buried far too long. And then, I heard it. The sound of bones snapping, of earth shifting. A deep, unnatural growl that came from deep beneath the ground. It was rising, whatever it was. The figures began to back away, their hollow eyes wide with terror. The ground shook more violently now, and I was thrown to the ground, the earth beneath me buckling, shifting like it was alive. It is here. The voice, no longer a whisper, echoed in my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to get up, to run, but the figures had closed in around me, trapping me in the circle. And then, I saw it. A figure rising from the grave at the center of the cemetery. Its body was rotted, decomposing, but it moved with a horrible, unnatural grace. Its eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. It was coming for me. I screamed, but nothing came out. The world around me spun, the cemetery, the figures, the growling from the earth all merging into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air. My heart was racing, my hands slick with sweat. My room was dark, the silence heavy, but the dream, the nightmare, still clung to me. I could still hear their whispers, feel their eyes on me. And deep down, I knew that whatever I had seen in that dream was more than just a vision. It was a warning. Something was rising. Something that would not be denied. And I was at the center of it. The morning felt unreal. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers over the city. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the air around me was different somehow. It was as though the world had taken on a new layer, a layer I couldn't see but could feel, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had spent the morning trying to convince myself that the night, the dream, the figures, had been nothing more than my mind playing tricks. That it was just the stress of being in an unfamiliar place, the city's eerie history getting to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers, the ritual, the strange feeling in the cemetery, it was all connected. I had to go back. The cemetery stood silent as I returned, its looming gates seeming to welcome me into the unknown. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, as if the very ground beneath me was holding its breath. The closer I got, the more I could feel that pull again, that terrible sense that something was waiting for me, lurking just beyond the shadows. As I stepped between the rows of graves, the weight of the earth thickened, and the ground beneath me felt strange, uneven, as though it too had been disturbed. My feet sank slightly with each step, the earth soft and unsettled. I didn't want to be here. I shouldn't be here. But I couldn't leave. Then, I saw it. A movement. A shadow rising from one of the graves, just ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, my eyes playing tricks after everything I had witnessed. But no! It was real. The grave was one of the oldest in the cemetery, its stone cracked and worn with time. I could barely make out the faded name carved into the surface, but there was something else, something far more unsettling. The dirt around the grave was disturbed, as if someone had been digging, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. And then it rose. At first, it was slow. A tremor, a shudder that ran through the earth, and then, slowly, agonizingly, it emerged. The figure was tall and twisted, its body jerking and twitching with every movement. The smell of decay hit me almost immediately, rotten flesh, the stench of death long forgotten, rising into the air. I tried to back away, but my legs felt frozen, my feet locked to the ground as I watched in horror. The figure's face was nothing but a mask of decomposition. Flesh hung in ragged pieces from the bones, its eyes were hollow, empty voids, and its mouth opened in a silent, grotesque scream. It stumbled forward, dragging its feet, its movements unnaturally stiff and jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Every movement was accompanied by a horrible cracking sound, the bones shifting and breaking as if they hadn't been used in centuries. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body refused to cooperate. Fear held me in place like a vice, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. The creature's head turned toward me, and for a moment its hollow eyes met mine. It was a gaze devoid of recognition, of humanity. It was the gaze of something that had never truly lived, something born of death and darkness. I felt my stomach lurch as it took a stumbling step forward. The smell of rot grew stronger, overwhelming, as it came closer. Its hands were outstretched, fingers curled like claws, reaching for me. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. I didn't know who I was pleading to. Myself? The creature? The air around me seemed to vibrate with an ominous energy, as though the earth itself was alive, holding its breath. It took another step, then another. And with each movement, the creature drew closer, its mouth opening wider, revealing a mass of decayed teeth and rotting flesh. There was no escape. I was trapped. I snapped back into reality, my legs finally responding, my instincts kicking in. I turned and ran, desperate, frantic, not daring to look back, but knowing that the horrible thing was following me. Its footsteps, heavy, slow, but relentless, echoed in my ears as I sprinted through the cemetery, dodging gravestones, stumbling over roots, feeling the cold air pressing down on me. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that. I had to find shelter, anything to hide, to escape. I turned a corner, and there, ahead of me, was the old chapel, its door slightly ajar. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The sound of the creature's footsteps grew distant, but I knew it wasn't over. It was still out there, waiting. Inside the chapel, I collapsed against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath. My hands trembled, my heart ached in my chest, and I tried to force myself to understand what had just happened. The nightmare was no longer just a dream. It was real. The dead were rising, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. In the darkness of the chapel, I could hear the faintest whisper, distant but unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard before, the voice that had filled my dreams. They are not at rest. And I realized, in that moment, the horrible truth. The cemetery, the graves, the people in the city, they were all part of something much darker than I could have imagined. The dead were rising, and I was at the center of it all. I had to get out, but I wasn't sure I could. I didn't stop running until I reached the gates of the cemetery. My lungs burned, my body was trembling with adrenaline, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to leave. The world outside the cemetery was blurry, distant, as if I had stepped through some invisible barrier and was waking up from a nightmare that refused to end. The gate was open, and I barely noticed the creaking as I shoved it aside, stumbling into the street. I was gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't even look back. I ran through the narrow streets of New Orleans, the soft hum of the city at night barely registering in my ears. The distant sounds of music, the occasional laughter from a bar, and the hum of passing cars, everything felt distant and muted, like I was hearing it through a thick fog. It wasn't real, none of it. The nightmare, the creature, the dead rising from their graves, it couldn't be real. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get as far away as possible from that cemetery, from the thing that had clawed its way out of the earth. I finally stopped when I found myself in a small alley, the cold air cutting through my clothes, sending a chill deep into my bones. My chest heaved with every breath, my body shaking with the aftershocks of the terror I had just experienced. I leaned against the wall, pressing my hands to my face, trying to steady myself. I could still feel the cold touch of the creature's fingers, still smell the rotting flesh, hear the crunching of bones, and see those hollow eyes staring at me. It was a hallucination, I told myself, my voice shaky, but firm. A trick of the mind, nothing more. The stress, the exhaustion, the unfamiliarity of the place, it got to me. I've been in strange places before, seen things that weren't there. It's all in my head. I closed my eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to force the images out of my mind. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the dread refused to leave. The sound of the creature's footsteps still echoed in my ears, the weight of its presence still hung in the air. The cold touch, the smell of rot, the voice that whispered in the back of my mind. They are not at rest. The words came again, soft but clear, like an imprint burned into my mind. I could still hear them, feel them, reverberating through my thoughts. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. I opened my eyes, the alley around me seeming too still, too quiet. My hand trembled as I wiped my forehead, the sweat cold against my skin. I looked up at the buildings around me, the narrow streets, the faint glow of streetlights. The world outside felt different now, as though I had crossed a threshold I couldn't come back from. I had felt it, the pull, the energy, the deep, gnawing sense of something wrong. It wasn't over. I knew that now. I had seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. I took a step forward, but then I froze. A soft scraping sound echoed in the distance. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A slow, dragging sound, like someone or something shuffling through the street. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the empty street behind me. I could hear the distant hum of the city, the usual nighttime noises, but the scraping sound was gone. It's nothing. Just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself again, forcing my feet to move. I walked quickly, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The dread lingered, settling deep in my chest like a weight that I couldn't shake off. I reached the corner of the block and glanced down the street, but everything was quiet. Peaceful, even. Too peaceful. The creeping unease tightened around me like a noose. I tried to push the thoughts away, to tell myself that I was safe, that it was over. But the fear, the terror, was still with me, lurking just beneath the surface. I couldn't outrun it. No matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, I knew the truth now. The dead weren't at rest. And somehow, I was tied to it. To them. I couldn't explain it, couldn't even begin to understand how or why. But there was no denying what I had seen. No denying what was happening in this city. The cemetery, the rituals, the whispers, they were all connected. And I was caught in the middle of it. I walked faster now, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I had to leave. I had to get out of New Orleans. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't that simple. The dread wouldn't let me go. And whatever force was behind the rising of the dead, whatever ancient power had awakened in that cemetery, it was still out there, waiting. It was coming for me. I could feel it. The days since my encounter at the cemetery blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. I tried to push the memory to the back of my mind, hoping that the terror I had experienced was just a product of stress and exhaustion. But no matter how hard I tried, the unease, the oppressive feeling that something was wrong, lingered like a shadow. It was in the air, in every corner of the city, in every whisper of the wind. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't stop thinking about the grave, the creature, the strange energy that seemed to pulse beneath the earth. And the whispers, the constant, lingering whispers. I couldn't shake them. They are not at rest. The words echoed in my mind, and with them came the suffocating fear that something was waking, something ancient and terrifying. I tried to carry on, to act as if everything was normal. I forced myself to walk the streets, to interact with the locals, to ignore the creeping sense of dread that followed me everywhere. But no matter how hard I tried to be normal, I couldn't pretend. I had to know more. I couldn't rest until I understood what was happening. I had to find answers, even if those answers terrified me. So, I turned to the only source of information I could think of, the very people who had warned me, the ones who had given me that unsettling glimpse into the city's secrets. The locals. I started by visiting the library, hoping to find anything that might explain what was going on. I pored over old records, historical documents, and books about the city's past. It didn't take long for me to find references to the cemetery, the one I had visited, the one that seemed to hold the key to everything. It was said to be one of the oldest burial grounds in the city, with a history steeped in mystery and legend. But the more I read, the more I realized that the true nature of the cemetery was buried beneath layers of silence and superstition. It was the locals who knew the truth. But they wouldn't speak. I could feel their eyes on me whenever I asked about the cemetery, about the strange happenings, about the odd rituals the city was said to harbor. They grew quiet, their faces unreadable, their voices tight with suspicion. I tried talking to them in the bars, the cafes, on the streets. Everywhere I went, I encountered the same wall of silence. The locals refused to acknowledge anything unusual. They acted as though I was crazy for even asking about it, as though the very mention of the cemetery was forbidden. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But the more I pressed, the more I realized something deeper was at play. They knew. They knew something, and they weren't going to tell me. One evening, as I was walking through the streets of the French Quarter, I spotted the old man, the one who had warned me the first night, the one whose cryptic words had stayed with me. He was sitting on a bench near the park, his back hunched and his eyes distant, lost in thought. I approached him cautiously, unsure if he would even remember me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quiet. I need to know more. About the cemetery. About what's happening here." He didn't look at me at first, but after a long pause, he slowly raised his head. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in them, a flicker of recognition, a flash of something darker, something I couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't be asking about that," he said, his voice low, gravelly, as though the words were weighed down with years of regret. "Some things are best left untouched. Some things, once you know them, you can't forget." "I've already seen too much," I replied, my voice shaking. "I can't ignore it. I need to understand." He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed, a sound like a long exhale of air. "I warned you. But it's too late now. You've seen what's beneath the surface, and it won't let you go." I leaned closer, my pulse racing. "What's happening? Why won't anyone talk about it?" His eyes flickered to the side, scanning the street nervously, before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The dead, they don't stay buried here. The cemetery, the rituals, they've been going on for years. The dead are not at rest. But you're in too deep now. You've disturbed something you shouldn't have." He stood up abruptly, his gnarled hand gripping the bench for support. "Get out. Leave New Orleans. It's not a place for outsiders anymore. The dead won't stop." Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, his shuffling footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. I stood there, stunned, trying to process his words, but they made no sense. The dead are not at rest. It was the same thing I had heard before, the same words, the same warning. But what did it mean? What was happening to the dead? Why were they rising? I walked back to my hotel room that night, but the questions swirled in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said. He knew. He knew something, and yet he refused to explain it fully. It was clear now that I couldn't trust the locals to tell me the truth. They were hiding something dangerous, and they weren't going to help me. The more I tried to understand, the more they pushed me away, as if they feared what I might uncover. The whispers were getting louder in my mind, the sense of unease growing stronger. I couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. I had to find the answers myself. The cemetery, the dead, the rituals, everything was connected, and I was the only one who could uncover the truth. But the deeper I went, the more I felt the pull, the suffocating grip of something dark and ancient that was closing in on me. I couldn't escape it. There was no turning back now. I had stepped into a world that was far darker than I ever imagined. And now, there was no way out. The longer I stayed in New Orleans, the harder it became to pretend everything was normal. It started with small things, small, unsettling things that I tried to ignore, brushing them off as coincidence or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't escape the sense that something was terribly wrong. It was the people at first. they started disappearing. At first, it was just one or two tourists I'd seen on the streets the day before, locals I'd talked to at the bar, but then it started happening more frequently. I'd meet someone one day, and the next, they were gone. No explanation. No sign of where they went. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. And when I asked anyone about it, they acted as if I were imagining things, as if I was the only one who noticed. One evening, I walked past a small cafe where I had spoken to a friendly waitress a couple of days earlier. Her name was Mia. She had seemed so full of life, her smile infectious, as she served me a cup of coffee and made casual conversation about the city. But tonight, the cafe was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of her. I asked the owner, a gruff man who didn't seem to have much time for small talk, where she had gone. "She's not here anymore," he replied flatly. "She left. People come and go. You get used to it." But it didn't make sense. Mia had seemed like she belonged here. Why would she just leave? Why would anyone just vanish like that? The next night, I noticed something else, odd sounds in the city, sounds that shouldn't be there. At first, they were just whispers, like the wind carrying distant voices through the narrow streets. But soon, it became something more. Low, guttural noises that echoed in the alleys, faint scraping sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I would hear them in the middle of the night, as I lay awake, my heart pounding, straining to catch any clue that could explain the horror that was building around me. I told myself it was just the sounds of an old city, that the creaking and groaning of buildings were nothing more than the normal wear and tear of an aging place. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something darker. And then, there were the shadows. It started one evening while I was walking back to my hotel after a long day of wandering the city. I had taken a different route, cutting through a side street I'd never noticed before. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. As I walked, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. But there was no one there. At least, not anyone I could see. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as nothing more than nerves. But the feeling lingered. It wasn't just the occasional glance over my shoulder, it was a constant sensation, as if someone, or something, was watching me. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see a figure standing in the shadows, waiting, watching. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, tall and thin, moving unnaturally fast down the alley behind me. It was too quick, too fluid, to be a person. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty alley, the dim lights, and the soft hum of the city. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But I knew something was following me. Something that didn't belong. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Everywhere I went, I felt the eyes on me. I heard whispers behind closed doors, laughter that sounded too eerie, too hollow. When I walked through the streets, I noticed more people staring at me, locals who would look away the moment I made eye contact, their faces cold, distant. I started to notice patterns. The people who disappeared weren't just tourists, they were all connected. I couldn't figure out how, but I knew it had something to do with the cemetery. Every person who had vanished, every unsettling event, all seemed to trace back to that cursed place. But the locals wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't acknowledge it. They wouldn't even look at me when I asked. I tried to speak to the old man again, the one who had warned me. I found him sitting by the same park bench, but when I approached him, he didn't even look up. His eyes were glazed over, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the bench. I called his name, but he didn't respond. His mind seemed lost, drifting somewhere far away. I couldn't understand it. Was he a part of whatever was happening? Had he been touched by the same madness that was seeping into the city? Or had he always known what was going to happen, and now it was too late for him to escape? My mind was spiraling. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into something I couldn't control, something I couldn't escape. The strange occurrences, the odd sounds, the disappearances, all of it was connected, and I was caught in the middle of it. But I had no way out. The city had already wrapped its claws around me, and it was only a matter of time before the darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dead were calling, pulling me deeper into their world. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to leave, they would find me. The city wouldn't let me go. I was being followed. And the thing following me wasn't human. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and the whispers in my mind grew louder, more persistent. It was as if the very air in New Orleans had become thick with an ancient, malevolent presence that clung to me wherever I went. Each day, I became more desperate to understand what was happening, but every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into something I wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, I wandered down an unfamiliar street, lost in thought and frustration. I hadn't seen anything new or useful in the library, and the locals remained tight-lipped whenever I tried to ask about the cemetery or its history. The city had become a maze of shadows and silence, and I was caught in the middle, trying to make sense of the madness. That's when I met her. She was sitting on a worn wooden bench outside a small, dimly lit shop. Her hair was dark and wild, her clothes simple but elegant, and there was something about her presence that made her stand out in the midst of the city's chaos. She looked at me as I passed, and for the first time in days, someone didn't look away. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a sense of recognition. Looking for answers? She asked, her voice soft but full of weight. She didn't wait for me to respond, instead motioning for me to sit beside her. You're one of the ones they always bring here. The ones who don't know when to stop. I hesitated, but something in her gaze pulled me in. I sat down beside her, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time in days. I'm trying to understand what's going on in this city, I said. The cemetery, the disappearances, the strange noises, there's something here. Something dark. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I thought you might be different. But you've come to the wrong place for answers, and you'll regret digging too deeply. I frowned. What do you mean? I need to know what's happening. People are disappearing, the dead are rising, and no one will tell me the truth. She glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, before leaning in closer. This city, it's cursed. You're standing on land that has seen more death and bloodshed than you can even imagine. The cemetery you've been visiting, it's not just a burial ground. It's a gateway. A place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. And it's been that way for centuries. My heart raced as her words sank in. A gateway? The idea was both terrifying and fascinating, but I couldn't deny the strange pull I felt toward the cemetery, the whispers that haunted my dreams, the eerie feeling that something was waiting for me there. Centuries ago, she continued, her voice low and serious, the land was used for rituals. Ancient, forbidden rituals. The people who lived here, they practiced magic, dark magic, to control the dead, to summon them. But they didn't know what they were playing with. They woke something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I stared at her, my mind racing. This was the most anyone had ever said about the cemetery, about the rituals. What did they wake? What happened to them? She sighed, her gaze distant as if reliving something painful. They thought they could control it, but the dead are not meant to be controlled. They rose, and with them came a curse. The land, the cemetery, it's all tied to the spirits of the dead. And every time someone tries to dig deeper, to disturb the graves, the curse grows stronger. But I saw them, I said, my voice shaking. I saw one of them rise. The dead, they're walking again. It's real. She looked at me, her eyes filled with sorrow. Yes. It's real. And it's been happening for as long as anyone can remember. The rituals were meant to keep them in check, but there's always someone who digs too deep, someone who doesn't understand the price of meddling with what shouldn't be disturbed. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I also felt something else, something darker. I've already seen too much. Her words echoed in my mind. The curse, the rituals, the land, it was all tied together. And I had already stepped too far into this nightmare to turn back now. Why aren't the locals telling me this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They've learned not to speak, she replied softly. There are eyes everywhere. The spirits are restless. And the dead don't forget. But you've been chosen. You've found your way here, and now you can't leave. The cemetery calls to those who will listen, and it will pull you back until you understand the truth. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Chosen? It felt like some kind of sick game, one I didn't want to play. But I couldn't deny the pull, the strange attraction I felt toward the cemetery, the sense that something, or someone, was waiting for me there. I don't want to know anymore, I said, trying to push the fear and confusion away. I just want to leave. I want to get out of this city. She shook her head slowly, her expression grave. It's too late for that. You can't leave now. You're already part of it. You'll feel the pull, and no matter how far you run, the cemetery will follow. The spirits will follow. And one day, they'll come for you. Her words settled into me like a heavy stone. I wanted to run, to flee this place, but something told me that no matter how far I went, I would never escape it. The curse had already found me. She stood up, brushing off her skirt, and looked at me one last time. Don't dig too deeply. You'll regret it. I wanted to ask her more, to demand answers, but before I could speak, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the streets of New Orleans. I sat there for a long time, my mind racing with what she had told me. The dead, the rituals, the curse, all of it had been buried for a reason. But now, it was rising again, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was trapped. I had dug too deeply. That night, I couldn't stay away any longer. The urge to return to the cemetery was unbearable, like a whispering voice in my head, urging me to come back. The woman's warning still echoed in my mind, don't dig too deeply. You'll regret it. But I was beyond reasoning now. The knowledge she'd shared only made me more desperate. I had to understand. I had to know what was truly happening here, and why the dead had started to walk again. The city was quieter than usual as I made my way through the narrow streets. The flickering streetlights cast long, jagged shadows, and the air felt heavier than it had before, thick with the scent of decay. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached the cemetery just before midnight, the gates looming in front of me like an iron mouth, swallowing the night. The iron bars groaned as I pushed them open, the sound sending a shiver through me. The graveyard, even in the dead of night, had a sinister beauty to it, its ancient tombs, towering statues, and crypts that looked like dark sentinels guarding secrets too terrible to reveal. I stepped inside, the ground beneath my feet soft and uneven. The air was cooler here, and the oppressive silence seemed to press against my skin, like the very atmosphere had thickened with the weight of the dead buried beneath. I could feel the pull again, stronger now. Something was waiting for me. I didn't know what, but it felt like I was being drawn deeper into a trap from which there would be no escape. As I moved through the gravestones, the shadows shifted. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the way the moonlight played on the old stone and the trees swayed in the wind. But then, the movement grew more deliberate. A shape, tall and twisted, lurked in the corner of my vision. I turned my head, and for a moment, I saw nothing but the empty graveyard bathed in silver light. But then, from behind one of the crypts, a figure emerged, slow and shambling, dragging itself through the earth with a guttural moan. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A zombie. The first one I'd seen up close, its decayed flesh hanging from its bones, its eyes wide and vacant. The reanimated corpse shuffled toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I froze, my body locked in place by terror. The zombie stumbled forward, its hands reaching out in desperation, its gaping mouth twisted into a grotesque imitation of a scream. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, retreating further into the cemetery. I had to get out. I had to. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way with a loud crack. I stumbled, falling into a shallow grave that had been dug into the earth. Pain shot up my leg as I landed awkwardly on my side. I struggled to my feet, panic rising as I realized I was surrounded. More figures were emerging from the graves, their stiff bodies rising like twisted nightmares from the earth. Zombies. A dozen or more, maybe more than that, shuffling toward me with the same lifeless determination. I could hear their labored breathing, the low moans as they dragged their bodies across the cemetery, drawn by the sound of my struggle. The air grew colder, a bone-chilling cold that sank into my skin, making it feel as though the very graveyard was closing in on me. I looked around desperately, but there was no escape. The cemetery stretched out before me, and the only thing I could see was death, and the hungry, decaying bodies of the undead. My breath quickened, my pulse racing in my ears as I tried to find some way out of this nightmare. But the longer I stayed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick with the weight of the dead, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the cemetery itself were alive. The shadows grew darker, longer, as the zombies closed in. I could hear their feet dragging against the earth, their groans getting louder with every passing second. I backed away, my eyes scanning the graveyard for a way out, but all I could see were the empty graves and the tombstones, like silent witnesses to my impending doom. Then, from somewhere deep in the cemetery, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. A noise that wasn't from the zombies, but something deeper, something older. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me, and I felt a chill run down my spine as the air turned heavy with the scent of decay. I spun around to find the source of the noise, but all I saw were the zombies, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions, their hands reaching for me with insatiable hunger. There was no time to think. no time to reason. I had to run, I had to. But just as I turned to flee, I heard another sound, a voice, distant at first, but growing louder. A voice whispering my name. "You're not meant to be here." I froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was a whisper, soft and cold, but it was real. The same voice I had heard in my dreams, the one that had haunted my every step. I turned back toward the cemetery, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw something I hadn't expected. A figure stood at the far end of the cemetery, draped in a flowing dark robe, its face obscured by a hood. It was taller than the zombies, its presence far more unsettling. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though reality itself was warping. The voice, now clearer, called out again. "Turn back." The zombies paused, their movements slowing as if in deference to the figure. It stood motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, from the chilling figure standing in the shadows. A deep, guttural sound filled the air, followed by the unmistakable cracking of bones. The zombies resumed their approach, but the figure was still there, unmoving. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The dead were rising not just because of some curse, but because of something far more sinister, a force that controlled them, a force that had been waiting, biding its time. And now, it was awake. The cemetery was alive. And it was coming for me. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled away from the looming figure, my legs finally finding the strength to carry me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the shuffling of the zombies behind me, their groans rising like a chorus of death. I was running on pure instinct now, the cold, oppressive air biting at my skin, the dark shapes of the dead closing in around me. I had to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, the cemetery seemed to stretch on endlessly, its labyrinth of tombstones, crypts, and graves growing more twisted with every step. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if the very ground was shifting beneath me, urging me deeper into the heart of the nightmare. I was losing track of time, of where I was in the cemetery. It felt as though I had crossed into another world, one where the rules no longer applied. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled upon something hidden. A small, barely noticeable path that veered off from the main walkways of the cemetery. It was overgrown with vines and weeds, the ground uneven, but something about it called to me. Desperation blurred my judgment as I turned toward it, hoping that somehow this would lead me to safety. I pushed through the tangled underbrush, the sounds of the zombies growing fainter behind me. The path twisted and wound its way through dense trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. It felt like I was being pulled deeper into the cemetery, into a place no one was meant to go. But still, I pressed on. I had no choice. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I emerged into a clearing, and the air hit me like a physical blow. It was different here, colder, denser, and charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath me felt wrong. The earth was too soft, almost spongy, and the air had a faint metallic taste to it. There was something about this place that made every nerve in my body scream at me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. In the center of the clearing, there was a circle of graves, old, withered stones that had been long forgotten by the living. The inscriptions were faded, worn down by time, but the shapes of the graves were different from the others I had seen in the cemetery. These graves were deeper, darker, their earth disturbed, as if something had recently risen from them. A strange, dark energy emanated from the area, and I could feel it in my bones. As I stepped closer, I saw it, the heart of the circle. An altar of sorts, made of stones arranged in a precise pattern, with symbols carved into them. Atop the altar, there was a small, rusted bowl filled with what looked like a dark liquid, slowly swirling on its own. The air around it shimmered, as though it was alive, pulsating with some unnatural force. A sickening realization slowly crept into my mind. The zombies weren't just rising. They weren't just a product of some curse, some accident of fate. They were being summoned. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The rituals. The rituals the woman had warned me about, the rituals to summon the dead, to control them, to awaken them. They weren't just ancient history. They were happening now. Right here. This was the heart of it, the source of the dark power that was making the dead walk. I looked around, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the discovery settling heavily on my chest. The graves were the key. The dead were not rising on their own, they were being called back. Summoned by someone, or something, with the knowledge of these rituals, someone who had awakened the power that lay dormant in the earth. The air crackled with tension, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet. The shadows around the clearing seemed to twist and pulse, as though something was stirring beneath them. I could hear faint whispers on the wind, words I couldn't quite make out, but they sounded like chants. I took another step back, my pulse racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever dark force had control here found me, too. But as I turned to flee, something stopped me. A presence, a weight in the air, as if I was no longer alone. I could feel it, pressing against me, surrounding me. And then I heard it. The low growl again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the zombies. It was coming from the earth itself. From the graves. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The ground was shifting. The earth trembled again, and the air seemed to freeze. A shape began to rise from one of the graves, slowly, deliberately, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The figure that emerged was not like the others. It was different, taller, its body draped in tattered, ancient robes, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. A figure of power, of ancient knowledge. The figure that had been behind it all. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind spinning. This wasn't just a cemetery. It was a place of ritual, a place where the dead were summoned, where dark forces were unleashed. And I had walked right into its heart. The figure raised its head, and I saw its eyes, black, empty voids, filled with an ancient hunger. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a curse. It was a summoning, a call to the dead. And I had been marked. Before I could even think to move, the figure spoke, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. You should not have come. Now you belong to us. The ground trembled again. The whispers grew louder. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the cemetery was no longer just a place of death. It was a place of power, power that was awakening, and it would not rest until it had claimed me, too. The zombies were just the beginning. The real nightmare was about to begin. I couldn't escape the image of the figure rising from the grave, its hollow eyes burning into me. The words it had spoken echoed in my mind, repeating like a curse. You belong to us. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow. This wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of power. The cemetery, its twisted rituals, the dark energy that clung to every corner, it all led back to the very heart of this city, to the people who lived here, to the locals who had woven their secrets into the fabric of New Orleans itself. I had to know more. I couldn't stop now. I had seen too much, and the knowledge gnawed at me. I had to understand what was happening here, what had been happening for so long. I spent the next few days in a frantic search for answers, diving deeper into the city's hidden history. The more I dug, the darker the truth became. Old books, worn diaries, and cryptic newspaper clippings whispered about rituals performed to control the dead, to harness their power, to summon them back from the grave. The locals, the ones who stayed hidden in the shadows, had always practiced these rites. Some believed it was a form of protection, while others saw it as a means of power over life and death. But as I dug deeper into the history, something disturbing began to surface. These rituals, once precise and controlled, had started to unravel. They were breaking down, losing their potency. The dead weren't staying put anymore. They weren't obeying. They were rising on their own, without the guidance of the ritualists who once held their strings. The evidence was scattered, fragments of old texts and whispered conversations from those who had lived through the chaos of earlier years. But there was a pattern, a trend. The ritualists had grown bolder over time, expanding the boundaries of their control, pushing the limits of what the dead could do. And in their greed, in their hunger for more power, they had broken something. I spent hours at the local library, combing through dusty old tomes, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The rituals had been designed to bind the spirits of the dead to the earth, to keep them in place. But somewhere along the way, those bindings had weakened. Now, the dead were rising without cause, without warning, breaking free of the control that had once kept them in their graves. The more I read, the clearer it became, the rituals weren't just failing. They were being corrupted. The ground itself seemed to be rejecting the dead. The land, the cemetery, the very soil was pushing back, calling the dead forth in an uncontrollable wave, and no one knew how to stop it. But there was one thing I couldn't understand. Why? Why were the dead rising in such numbers now? Why had it all started recently? It didn't make sense. I had to find the answers, but there was no one left to ask. The locals, the ones who knew the truth, were too afraid to speak. I had heard enough warnings, enough cryptic messages to understand that whatever was happening in this city, it wasn't meant to be uncovered. I left the library late that night, the weight of everything I had uncovered pressing down on me. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. As I walked through the empty streets, I felt it again, the same sensation I had felt when I first entered the cemetery. That unease, that pull towards something I couldn't explain. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the corner of a narrow street, just beyond the flickering streetlight. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, another shadow playing on my overactive mind. But as I drew closer, I could make out the details, a figure draped in a dark robe, its face obscured. The same figure from the cemetery. The one I had seen rising from the grave. It was there, watching me. Waiting. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, as if daring me to come closer. For a moment, I was frozen, caught between fear and curiosity. But then, the figure lifted its head slightly, and I heard it. A low, almost inaudible whisper, barely carried on the wind. The ritual is failing. I didn't know how to respond. The figure hadn't spoken before, hadn't given any sign of life except for its eerie presence in the cemetery. But now, here it was again, and I had the sinking feeling that I was being drawn into something much larger than myself. "You've seen too much," it continued, its voice almost a hiss. "The dead are not ours to control. You should have left when you had the chance." I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The fear that had been building in me since I first set foot in New Orleans, since I had first stepped into the cemetery, had culminated in this moment. I was in the heart of something I couldn't understand, something ancient and powerful, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to survive it. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, like an omen, a reminder of what I had uncovered. "The dead are rising," it said once more, its voice low and chilling. "But there is something worse. Something older." I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach tightening. I had learned too much, uncovered too many truths. But now, the weight of that knowledge was pressing on me, threatening to crush me under its enormity. I knew what I had to do. I had to stop this. But how? The figure's eyes seemed to pierce me, and I felt the undeniable urge to look away. I took a step back, and then another, turning toward the distant hum of the city streets. Before I could turn completely, I heard one final whisper, carried on the breeze. "Leave while you still can." But it was too late. The ritual had already begun, and there was no escaping it now. I couldn't shake the warning from the figure in the streets. "Leave while you still can," it had said, and the words reverberated in my mind like a pulse, a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I had barely made it through the door of my hotel when I realized that I couldn't stay here, not with everything I had learned, not with the weight of what was coming. I needed answers. More than the half-whispers from the locals, more than the cryptic warnings. I needed to understand why the dead were rising, why the rituals were failing, and, most importantly, how to stop it. There had to be someone who knew something, someone who could shed light on the mystery without warning me to leave. I wandered the streets for hours, aimlessly at first, hoping that something or someone would lead me in the right direction. The city felt different now, more oppressive, as though the very air itself was thick with dark energy. The usual vibrancy of New Orleans had vanished, replaced by unsettling silence. The music that had once echoed through the streets seemed distant, like a memory. As I passed a small, dimly lit bookshop tucked between two tall buildings, I caught sight of something that stopped me in my tracks. A weathered sign hanging above the door read "Historical Oddities, a collection of the supernatural." Something about it pulled me in, a thread tugging at the back of my mind, urging me to go inside. I entered the shop cautiously, the smell of old paper and incense hanging in the air. The shelves were crammed with books, trinkets, and curiosities, most of them about the occult, ancient rites, and strange occurrences. The atmosphere was heavy with the sense of something hidden, something forgotten by time. Behind the counter stood a man who didn't look much older than me, but there was something unnervingly ageless about him. His clothes were simple, a long coat that looked like it hadn't seen the light of day in years, and his eyes were sharp, almost piercing. When he noticed me, he gave me a knowing look, as if he had been expecting me. "You look like someone in need of answers," he said without preamble, his voice low and steady. He didn't ask me to sit, but it felt like an unspoken invitation. I didn't hesitate. I was desperate. "I need to know about this cemetery," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the shop. "Something's wrong there. The dead, they're rising." He didn't react to my words the way most people did. There was no surprise, no disbelief. Instead, He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You've seen it, haven't you? I swallowed, the truth hanging between us like a thread I couldn't escape. Yes, I admitted. I've seen the zombies, and I don't know how to stop it. The man's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're not the first to ask about the cemetery. And you won't be the last, I'm afraid. But you're the first to seek the truth. I stared at him, confused. The truth? He nodded, his expression turning serious. The cemetery you've been visiting, the one where the dead rise, it was built over something much older. An ancient burial ground. One that predates New Orleans itself. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean, older? How can that be? The man's eyes glinted with a strange intensity. Long before the city was founded, long before the French or Spanish arrived, this land was sacred. It was inhabited by the native tribes of the region, tribes that practice rituals far darker than anything you can imagine. The ground you walk on, the very earth of that cemetery, is soaked in blood from centuries of offerings to the spirits of this land. Powerful spirits, not the kind you pray to, but the kind you fear. I shook my head, the weight of his words pushing against my sanity. Spirits? You're saying the cemetery is built over a burial ground? He nodded. Not just any burial ground. A place where the spirits were bound to the earth, to the land itself. But these spirits weren't meant to rest. They were tied to the land by rituals that, over time, were forgotten or twisted into something else. They are ancient, vengeful beings, and they are no longer content to stay buried. I felt a chill run through me as he spoke. But the rituals, the locals, I murmured, trying to make sense of it all. Are they trying to control them? He nodded again. Yes. The locals, those who still remember the old ways, perform their own rituals, rites designed to keep the spirits at bay, to bind the dead. But as with any powerful force, the more they meddle, the more unpredictable it becomes. These spirits, these forces, they are not meant to be controlled. The rituals, as you've already seen, are failing. The dead are rising on their own, without cause, without control. And the more they rise, the stronger the spirits become. My heart began to race. So, what you're saying is, the cemetery wasn't just a burial ground for the dead. It's a place that holds something much darker, something that's coming back to life. The man's face darkened. Exactly. And the land is waking up. The spirits that were once bound to the earth are now free, and they seek to reclaim what is theirs. I could barely breathe. What do they want? They want what they've always wanted, he said, his voice dropping lower. Control. Power. The ability to cross the boundary between life and death. They want to break the barrier that separates the living from the dead, and they will do anything to achieve it. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. And how do I stop it? How do I stop them? The man studied me for a long moment, his gaze intense, calculating. Finally, he spoke. You can't stop them alone. No one can. The ritual that binds the dead is old, but it is not easily undone. But there are others, those who still know the old ways. If you want to understand how to stop it, you'll need to find them. You'll need to find the heart of the ritual, the source of the power. If you can do that, maybe, just maybe, you can sever the connection and stop the dead from rising. He paused, his voice growing quieter. But be warned, the spirits will not let you walk away once you've found them. And there are those who will do anything to keep the rituals alive. I swallowed hard. Where do I start? He gave me a pointed look, his eyes cold and calculating. Start with the cemetery. The heart of the ritual lies there. But be careful. Once you disturb what has been buried, there is no going back. The room seemed to grow colder as he finished speaking, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been given a map to my own doom. But it was too late to turn back now. I had already seen too much. I had already walked too far down this path. I had to find the heart of the ritual. I had to stop this before it consumed everything. Before it consumed me. Thank you, I said, but my voice was barely a whisper. The weight of the knowledge he had given me felt like a stone in my chest, but I had no choice. I had to go to the cemetery again. And this time, I would go deeper. Much deeper. The air felt thicker tonight, heavier, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on me. I knew I shouldn't be here, not after everything I had learned, not after the warnings. But there was no turning back now. The pieces were falling into place, and the only way to find answers was to see the ritual with my own eyes. I had spent the last few days gathering what little information I could. The locals had stopped talking, the strange historian had all but sealed my fate, and the more I learned, the clearer it became that I was in the middle of something far darker than I had ever imagined. But none of that prepared me for what I was about to witness. I crept through the cemetery's gates under the cover of night, my steps silent on the worn path. The moon hung low, casting a pale light over the rows of graves, their stones cracked and weathered by time. The usual chill in the air seemed sharper tonight, more oppressive, as though the spirits themselves were stirring in anticipation. I had heard the whispers of rituals, dark, ancient rites designed to control the dead, but I never imagined I would witness one firsthand. Still, a sense of urgency drove me forward. I needed to know what was happening here. I needed to understand why the dead were rising. I moved deeper into the cemetery, my breath shallow and uneven, the silence stretching around me like a waiting void. Then, as I turned a corner, I froze. A clearing lay ahead, bathed in an eerie light. Figures were gathered in a circle around an open grave. They were cloaked in dark, flowing robes, their faces obscured by shadows. Their movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as they chanted in a language I couldn't understand. The air seemed to hum with their words, the energy in the cemetery shifting, as though the ground itself was vibrating in response to their summons. I instinctively crouched behind a large mausoleum, trying to stay out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees, but the sounds of the ritual drowned it out. I watched in horror as the figures raised their hands toward the sky, their voices growing louder, their chants more frantic. And then it happened. The ground trembled beneath me. The earth seemed to ripple, as though something deep below was shifting. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. Slowly, the grave in the center of the ritual began to open. At first, it was just a tremor, a subtle movement of soil. Then the earth began to crack and shift, as if something was forcing its way out. The figures around the grave didn't flinch, their chants never wavered. They were guiding whatever was rising, calling it forth, coaxing it from the depths. I could hear it now, the scraping of bones against dirt, the guttural sound of something clawing its way to freedom. The air thickened, filled with the stench of rot and decay. My stomach lurched, but I couldn't look away. A hand broke through the soil first, pale and skeletal, followed by an arm, then a twisted torso. The corpse that emerged was far from human. Its skin was thin and gray, its eyes hollow, its mouth slack and open in a silent scream. As it rose, it moved with jerky, unnatural motions, its body stiff and uncoordinated, yet there was a malevolent energy that seemed to radiate from it. The figure in the grave was not alone. More hands broke through the soil, and with each new corpse, the chanting grew louder. Figures were emerging from all around the clearing now, dozens of them, their bodies grotesque and twisted, their movements slow but deliberate. Their eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them, only an emptiness that seemed to draw the very light from the world. The figures in the robes continued their chanting, their voices blending into a single, haunting melody. They didn't seem to care that the dead were rising, that their summons had worked. They were in control, or so they thought. But as the last of the dead clawed its way from the grave, something shifted. The air, already thick with dread, seemed to hum louder. The earth trembled beneath my feet, and I felt a strange pull, like the spirits themselves were aware of my presence. The zombies stood, stiff and motionless for a moment, their heads turning toward the robed figures with unnerving synchronicity. Then, as if on cue, they moved. The robed figures had called them forth, but now they were no longer under control. The zombies lurched toward the ritualists, their movements fast and unnatural, as though some unseen force was driving them. The first robed figure tried to raise his hands in some final attempt at control, but it was too late. A zombie lunged at him, its decayed mouth snapping open as it tore into his flesh. The others followed, their movements erratic but deadly. I stumbled back, my heart racing, nausea surging through me. The air was thick with the sound of cracking bone and the shrill screams of those who had once been human. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the nightmare unfolding before me. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse with energy, the connection between the dead and the living growing stronger with every passing second. I watched as the last of the robed figures was dragged to the ground, his screams silenced as the undead tore him apart. The ritual had failed. The dead had risen, but they had broken free of the control of their summoners. Now they were driven by something far darker, something that could not be stopped. I couldn't stay. I couldn't witness any more. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run, to escape this madness before it consumed me too. I turned and bolted, my heart hammering in my chest, the sounds of the undead and their twisted feast echoing in my ears. I didn't look back. But I knew, deep down, that the nightmare was far from over. The dead were free, and something even darker was coming. Something that would not stop until it had claimed everything. And I was now part of it. Panic seized me before I even had time to process what was happening. I had witnessed something unspeakable, something that shouldn't have been possible. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and now the dead were rising, not by the will of the living, but because they were being driven by some primal force. Something far darker than I could comprehend. I ran through the cemetery, my legs shaking beneath me, my mind screaming for a way out. But the sounds behind me, bones cracking, flesh tearing, the guttural growls of the undead, pursued me, relentless and unforgiving. I could hear the distant echoes of their screams mingled with the desperate pleas of the ritualists who had failed to control them. It was like a nightmare that had bled into reality, and I couldn't wake up. I took a sharp turn around one of the tombs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to find an exit. I had to get out before they caught me. But when I turned the corner, I froze. There was no escape. The cemetery, once an eerie and quiet place, had transformed into a hellscape. Zombies were everywhere, shuffling across the ground, their hands reaching out toward anything that moved. Some were still in the process of clawing their way out of the graves, while others wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow and empty. The air was thick with the stench of decay and blood, the earth beneath my feet still shaking as more bodies forced their way to the surface. But it wasn't just the number of zombies that terrified me, it was their strength. They were no longer slow and lumbering like I had seen before. They were moving with purpose, their movements faster and more coordinated. It was as though something was guiding them now, pushing them forward with an insatiable hunger. And the worst part was that they were growing stronger by the minute. I could feel the pressure in the air, a weight I couldn't escape. I thought I had seen the worst of it, but now, with each step I took, it was clear this was only the beginning. The earth beneath the cemetery was alive with the power of the dead, and it seemed to be spreading. The further I moved, the more the ground trembled, the more the zombies multiplied. I turned to look back. The figure of a child, her face hollow, her hair matted and wet with dirt, shuffled toward me. Her eyes were wide open, but they were empty, void of any recognition. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and yet purposeful. She was no longer just a mindless corpse, she was a part of something greater. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I was trapped, surrounded by the very thing I feared the most. There was no escape from this nightmare. The cemetery, the dead, the ritual, it was all connected, spiraling out of control. I had made a mistake by coming here, by thinking I could simply watch, by believing that I could understand what was happening. Now, the only thing I could do was survive. I spun on my heels and ran, pushing myself harder than ever, my lungs burning with the effort. My thoughts raced, but they were clouded with terror, every step I took only seeming to drive the realization deeper into my chest. The dead were not just rising, they were multiplying. And if I didn't escape soon, there would be no place left for me to hide. But even as I sprinted through the cemetery, I knew it was already too late. The land itself was changing, becoming something dark and twisted, as though it were alive with the hunger of the dead. I could feel it, like a pulse beneath my feet, the world shifting with every tremor. The boundaries between life and death were starting to blur. And I was stuck in the middle, with no way out. The cemetery was no longer just a place of burial, it was the heart of something far more dangerous, and its power was growing with each passing moment. The zombies were no longer merely creatures of decay, they were becoming something else. Something that couldn't be stopped. I could see more of them now, their numbers swelling, moving toward me, as though the land itself was pulling them in. I had no choice but to keep running, to try and outrun the flood of death that was swallowing everything in its path. But as I ran, a terrible thought gripped me. Even if I could escape the cemetery, even if I could outrun the zombies, would I ever truly be free? Would I ever be able to escape the horror that had been unleashed? The answer was clear. No. No, I wouldn't. My legs burned from running, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. Behind me, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder, closer. The air around me pulsed with a sickening energy, thick with the stench of death. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet, the earth alive with the force of the undead rising from their graves. I was trapped, cornered. Every path I turned down seemed to lead to more of them. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but my mind couldn't keep up. The cemetery, once just a burial ground, had turned into a hunting ground. The zombies were everywhere now, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Their twisted bodies lurched forward, not stumbling like before, but moving with an eerie coordination. They were drawn to me, the same way a moth is drawn to light. Their eyes, once hollow, now gleamed with a terrible hunger and emptiness that felt like it was pulling me in. I reached a high wrought iron gate at the edge of the cemetery, but when I grabbed the bars, they rattled against my hands like bones in the wind. The gate was locked. I pulled harder, desperate, but it didn't budge. I could hear them behind me now, growling, shuffling, the scrape of decayed feet dragging across the ground. They were closing in. There was no way out. I turned back toward the cemetery, my pulse pounding in my ears, and looked around for anything that could help me escape. But the path was filled with them, zombies dragging themselves closer with every passing second. Their bodies were disfigured, their faces slack, their limbs stiff and unnatural, but their movement was purposeful. And they were getting stronger. I had nowhere to go. The cold grip of fear took hold of me, tightening around my chest. There were too many. The ritual had failed, and now the dead were free to roam, multiplying faster than I could run. I had seen what they could do, what they had done to those who tried to control them. There was no stopping them now. No way to reverse the curse. Panic began to set in, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I could feel my heart racing, each breath a shallow gasp as my mind screamed for a way out. I looked toward the distant woods, beyond the gates. Could I make it? Could I escape into the unknown, out of the reach of the zombies? Or would I be caught, like so many others before me? I took a step back, the ground beneath me trembling again, and a wave of terror rushed over me. The zombies were closing in fast now. I had no time to think. No time to second-guess myself. And then, I saw something in the distance. Through the thick fog, I could just make out the figure of a shadowy figure, standing near a mausoleum. It was a man, someone I hadn't seen before. His posture was rigid, but his presence seemed almost to command the attention of the dead. The zombies had stopped moving. They were staring at him, waiting. I couldn't be sure, but something told me that this man might know what to do. Or maybe he was the one who could stop them. But as I ran toward him, something cold wrapped around my heart. The figure didn't move. The closer I got, the more I realized that he wasn't alive. His face was gaunt, his eyes empty. He was another one of them. The realization hit me like a wave of icy water. There was no escape. The zombies were everywhere. The undead weren't just wandering, they were waiting. They were hunting. And the cemetery wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap. I had to make a choice. I could fight, try to confront them, to somehow end this madness. But I knew it was hopeless. I had no weapon, no way to fight back against an army of the dead. My chances of survival were slim. Or I could flee. Flee into the unknown, into the dark woods, where I might find safety, or where I might lose myself forever. The zombies were closing in. I could see their hollow eyes fixed on me, their mouths open, emitting low growls. The moment had arrived. My heart raced, my mind scrambled for a decision. I took a deep breath. The air was heavy, thick with dread, but I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stay here, surrounded by death, with no way to fight it. I had to run. I turned toward the woods. My legs were weak, but I forced myself to move, my body numb with fear. I could hear the zombies behind me, their feet dragging closer, their growls growing louder. I ran. The cemetery was behind me now, but the path ahead was shrouded in darkness. The trees loomed, tall and foreboding, and the shadows stretched long across the ground, reaching toward me. I couldn't stop to look back. I couldn't afford to waste a second. The sound of the zombies chasing me was like a chorus of death, but I didn't slow down. I pushed through the underbrush, my lungs burning, my heart thudding in my chest. The woods were thick, dense with trees, but I knew one thing for certain now. I had to keep moving. There was no turning back. I had made my choice. But in the deep, sinking pit of my stomach, I knew something worse was coming. The cemetery had been only the beginning. The dead weren't just here. They were everywhere. And no matter where I ran, the shadows would always follow. Because now, the dead were awake, and there was no place left to hide. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable as I ran, my breath coming in frantic gasps, my legs barely holding me up. The cemetery, with all its horrors, had faded behind me, but I couldn't shake the images of the undead, those lifeless eyes staring into mine, the ground churning with their rising bodies. I was still running, but the fear had turned into something else, something deeper. My body was moving on instinct, but my mind was elsewhere. It was caught in a spiral of doubt, of disbelief, trying to make sense of what had happened. Did I really see it? Did I really witness the dead rising from their graves, clawing their way to the surface with a hunger that could not be sated? Or had it all been some twisted dream, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? I stumbled, nearly tripping over an exposed root, and barely managed to catch myself. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat a reminder of how close I had come to being one of them, just another rotting body, clawing at the earth. The woods were silent now, the usual sounds of night replaced by the steady hum of my own panicked thoughts. I had escaped the cemetery, yes, but in doing so, I felt as though I had left part of myself behind. The terror still clung to me, like a suffocating fog that wouldn't let go. I couldn't seem to breathe without it filling my lungs. As I moved deeper into the woods, the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, as though they were watching, waiting. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the zombies trailing me, their hollow eyes fixed on my every movement. But the path behind me remained empty. Silent. I thought I'd be relieved, that the absence of danger would bring a sense of calm. But instead, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. What if they were still out there? What if the horrors of the cemetery hadn't been contained within its gates, but were now spreading, spilling into the world outside? My mind raced, spinning out of control. I pushed forward, faster now, trying to outrun the weight of my own thoughts. But the more I tried to outrun them, the more they followed me, clinging to my every step. The air was thick with the smell of decay, like it had settled into the very fibers of my clothes, into my skin. It felt like I could still smell them, the rotting flesh, the cold earth, the unmistakable scent of death. I stumbled onto a dirt path, one that looked vaguely familiar, but everything felt wrong now. The woods had changed. The trees seemed taller, their limbs twisted and gnarly, as though they were reaching out to grab me. I kept walking, unsure of where I was heading, but unable to stop. Every step felt like it could be my last. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light through the branches. My shadow stretched long in front of me, making me feel as though I were being followed. I was running from the zombies, from the cemetery, but I was also running from something deeper, something within me that I couldn't escape. The memory of their faces, of their cold, lifeless eyes, haunted me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just running from them. I was running from myself. I had to stop. I had to think. But the more I tried to process what had happened, the more the world around me seemed to slip out of focus. I began questioning everything, every sound, every movement, every flicker of light in the corner of my vision. Was it real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? I sat down on a large rock by the path, trying to steady my breathing, but my hands shook uncontrollably. I wrapped my arms around myself, as though trying to hold my very soul together. Was I going mad? The thought gnawed at me, clawing at my mind. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the horrors in the cemetery were nothing more than a fever dream, a product of too much fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen. I had felt it, the tremor in the ground, the pull of the dead reaching for me. It wasn't just in my mind. It was real. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The fear, the sheer terror, still gripped me, and I couldn't tell if it was from what I had witnessed or from the slow realization that I might never be safe again. I pushed myself to my feet, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead. I had to keep moving. There was no other choice. The longer I stayed still, the more the dread began to consume me. I heard something then, a snap of a twig, the faintest rustle of leaves. My body went rigid, every muscle tensed, my senses on high alert. I turned quickly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. It was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But the doubt lingered. The fear remained. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I tried to leave. I had to. The thought of New Orleans, with its dark streets and cursed cemetery, filled me with dread. The city was alive with an unsettling energy, like a predator waiting to strike. I needed to escape, needed to get as far away as possible from the horrors that had followed me here. The morning sun offered no comfort. It hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets of the French Quarter. But something was wrong. The city, usually bustling with the sounds of life, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, was eerily silent. The streets were empty. Not a soul in sight. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing against the cobblestone. The air was thick, heavy with humidity, but it felt colder than it should have. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, smothering me, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The usual smells, Cajun food, spices, the scent of freshly baked bread, were absent. All that lingered in the air was a faint, acrid odor, like something rotting just out of sight. I walked faster. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, prickling with an instinctive fear I couldn't explain. I had to get out. As I turned a corner, I glimpsed the distant outline of the river. The docks were just ahead. I could take a boat, or a cab, or maybe just keep walking until I was far enough away to breathe again. I moved toward it, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But even then, something was wrong. The further I walked, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the city itself was pushing me back. The streets felt narrower now, the buildings looming taller, closing in on me. The old, crumbling facades seemed to grow more sinister with every step, as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned another corner, hoping to find an open street, but the same narrow alleys and closed doors greeted me. It was as if the city had twisted itself around, trapping me in some kind of nightmare. I was sure I had passed the same street twice. Maybe 3 times. But no matter how many corners I turned, the same empty streets greeted me, the same silent facades staring down at me. Panic began to claw at my chest. The sense of being watched intensified, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. I could feel the weight of the city pressing in on me, closing in tighter with each passing second. I pulled my phone from my pocket, desperate for a signal, but the screen was blank. The battery had died hours ago. The sound of a distant groan stopped me in my tracks. I froze. The noise came again, a low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of the dead, dragging their decaying bodies along the earth, rising from the grave. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, some trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. The dead were here, and they were calling to me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty street behind me. Nothing. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't tell if the chill I felt was from the breeze or from the growing sense of dread in my bones. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, my breath shallow and uneven. The sounds of the city, what little there were, faded into the background. All I could hear was the soft shuffle of my own footsteps and the growl that echoed from somewhere in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. It was like they were getting closer, drawing nearer with each step I took. I turned another corner, my eyes darting around, searching for some sign of life, some escape. But the street was still empty, eerily so. The distant groan grew louder, closer now, unmistakable. The dead were coming for me. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop. I had to leave, had to get away from this cursed city. I had to escape before the darkness caught me. As I ran, I passed the doors of a local shop, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, or someone, standing in the window. A face, pale and twisted, staring out at me with hollow eyes. But before I could stop or process what I had seen, the groaning sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint shuffle of footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The streets were becoming more distorted now. The buildings seemed to close in on me, their structures bending at strange angles, as though the city itself was warping. The world was slipping away from me, and I could feel my sanity starting to unravel. The sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, more distinct. They were right behind me now. I could hear the scrape of decayed feet dragging along the street. I could smell them now, the stench of death, of decay. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, like the city was alive, moving beneath me. I turned yet another corner, but this time, the street ahead wasn't empty. A figure stood in the middle of the road. A man, or what was left of him. His face was ashen, his body stiff and unnatural, moving with jerky, disjointed motions. His eyes were vacant, hollow, dead. And then, behind him, I saw more. The streets were filled with them. Dozens. Hundreds. The dead were here. And they weren't just in the cemetery anymore. They were everywhere. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. My breath caught in my throat. The streets of New Orleans, once alive with energy, had become a trap, a labyrinth of death. The dead had spread, and now there was no escaping. I had come to the city to leave the past behind. But it seemed the past had followed me, and it would never let go. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick with the stench of death and decay, and as the group of zombies closed in, I thought it was the end. They were all around me now, stumbling toward me with that same grotesque, jerky movement, their hollow eyes fixed on me as though I were nothing but prey. I turned, ready to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. But then, before I could take another step, a loud crash broke the silence of the streets. A door slammed open nearby, and before I could react, someone grabbed my arm and yanked me forward. I stumbled, caught off guard, and was pulled into an alleyway by a pair of strong hands. The world spun around me, but I quickly regained my balance. The figure who had grabbed me, a man, dressed in torn clothing, sweat slicked across his brow, pulled me into the shadows of a narrow alley, away from the horde of undead. He didn't say anything at first, just looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide with terror. "Stay down," he hissed, pulling me lower into the alley. His grip was firm, almost painfully so, but it was the only thing keeping me from being dragged back into the streets. I obeyed, crouching behind a stack of crates, my heart racing, and tried to listen through the pounding of blood in my ears. The growing of the zombies grew distant, but the fear remained in my chest, choking me. I risked a glance around the corner and saw them, dozens of zombies, their hands reaching and scraping along the cobblestones, still wandering aimlessly, their movements as slow and relentless as ever. But something was off. They weren't just wandering anymore. Their movements were more deliberate, more focused. It was as if they were hunting, searching. "They're getting smarter," the man beside me muttered, his voice low and strained. "They're learning." The statement hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to look at him, but he wasn't done. He had his hand pressed against his face, as if trying to block out the sounds of the undead. Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. He glanced at me, his eyes hardening, his expression grim. "You don't want to know. But we don't have time for questions. They're everywhere now. The city is falling apart, piece by piece." Before I could ask anything else, another figure appeared beside us, this one a woman, her face smeared with dirt, her clothes worn and ragged. She didn't say anything at first, just stood silently, watching the street, her face set in an expression of quiet determination. "Is it bad?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer at first, but when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with the weight of truth. "It's worse than you think. The dead aren't just rising from graves anymore. They're spreading, creeping into every part of the city. It's like the ground itself is being infected." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean, the ground?" "People are starting to disappear. Not just in the cemetery, but all over. In the city, everything around us is changing," the woman continued, her eyes darting nervously to the street. "The zombies are getting stronger. They're more coordinated now. And they're being summoned. We don't know by who, but we've seen it. The dead aren't just walking, they're being called." The words hit me hard, but it was the growing sense of hopelessness in her voice that sent a chill down my spine. These weren't just the ramblings of a mad person. There was something happening here, something I hadn't fully understood until now. "You're saying this isn't just some outbreak?" I asked, my throat dry. The man who had dragged me into the alley nodded slowly. "No. This is something else. It's like the city itself has become a battleground. The dead are being raised, summoned, by forces we can't understand. And the people who are left, those of us still alive, we're stuck in the middle." I took a shaky breath, trying to make sense of everything. How long has this been happening?" "Longer than you think," the woman replied. "The city's been in chaos for weeks now. At first, it was just a few reports. Strange disappearances. People going missing and then showing up days later, their bodies different. No one believed it until the cemetery started to wake up. That's when it all changed. But the dead in the cemetery." I trailed off, the memory of the undead rising still fresh in my mind. That's where it started? The man nodded grimly. Yeah. And now it's spread everywhere. We're all stuck here, trying to survive. We thought we had a chance at first. Thought we could hold out. But now... He stopped, as if the words were too heavy to continue. The woman cut in, her voice tight with urgency. If we don't get out of here soon, there won't be anywhere to run. The undead, they're stronger now. Smarter. And if the rituals are breaking down, we don't know how long they have left before the whole city becomes their hunting ground. The words hit me like a wave of cold water. I knew the city was changing, but hearing it from them, hearing the fear in their voices, made the situation feel even more real, more imminent. How? How do we stop it? I asked, my voice barely audible. The man shook his head. We don't. Not anymore. We're just trying to survive, trying to find other survivors. The rest of the city is lost. The woman's eyes hardened. But we can't just wait to die. We've got to keep moving. If we don't, they'll find us. They always do. I swallowed hard, looking around at the abandoned alley, the crumbling buildings, the broken city that had once been so full of life. The streets that had once been filled with music and laughter now felt like a tomb, suffocating and dead. The zombies weren't the only thing we had to worry about anymore. The city itself was becoming part of the nightmare. And if we didn't move quickly, we wouldn't escape it. But how could we run when there was nowhere left to hide? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like the walls were closing in, and I could hardly breathe as the realization sank in. There was no way out. The man and woman, who had been my only source of hope since my arrival in New Orleans, exchanged grim looks. We sat in the dim alley, away from the roaming undead, but I could hear the faint groans and shuffles in the distance, the constant reminder of the threat that loomed over the entire city. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I struggled to keep my voice steady. You mean, we're trapped here? I asked, my words barely coming out as a whisper. I couldn't bring myself to say it louder. The thought of being completely surrounded by the dead, of being stuck in a city where escape was impossible, was too much to handle. The woman nodded slowly, her expression hardening. Yeah. They've spread beyond the cemetery. It's not just the old graves anymore, those rituals, they've opened something. The dead are everywhere now. And the city's falling apart faster than anyone can keep up with. But the streets... I started, looking toward the path we had just run down, now empty and silent, as though the city itself had become a graveyard. I thought people were still trying to leave. They are, the man muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's not working. People try to get out, but the roads are blocked. The dead are everywhere. And even those who make it out, they don't come back. We've been trying to reach the outskirts, but there's no safe place anymore. The city's it's becoming part of the land of the dead. The woman looked out at the distant horizon, her face pale but resolute. The locals, they've already accepted it. Most of them have. The ones who aren't already dead or hiding are just waiting for it to come for them. I couldn't understand it. How could anyone just accept their fate like that? I had heard of cities falling to disaster, but this was something else. The world outside was fading, and New Orleans had become a graveyard, a trap with no way out. How long have you been here? I asked them, my voice strained. How long have you been stuck in this nightmare? The woman sighed, her eyes tired. Weeks. maybe longer. I can't even remember anymore. At first, we thought it was just an outbreak. A few odd things happening, people going missing, people acting strange, but then her voice faltered and I could see the pain in her eyes. Then it got worse. The dead rose, the rituals started unraveling, and the city changed. We've lost track of time. We've been moving from place to place, the man added, shaking his head. But there's nowhere to go. People who've tried to leave, none of them come back. Either they're swallowed up by the undead, or the city itself traps them. There's no safe place. Not anymore. I swallowed hard. So, what do we do now? We can't just stay here forever. The woman's gaze softened for a moment. We keep moving. We find other survivors. We try to survive, but that's all we can do now. There's no cure. No escape. The dead have already won. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at them, tell them they were wrong, that we still had a chance, that we could fight back, somehow. But the truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating every word I tried to say. The dead weren't just in the cemetery anymore. They had spread like a plague, infecting every corner of the city. And as much as I wanted to believe there was hope, deep down I knew they were right. The city had fallen. The dead were winning. And there was no escape. The man and the woman started to rise, gesturing for me to follow them. We can't stay here for long, the man said. We need to move before they realize we're here. Where do we go? I asked, my voice cracking. What's left? The woman didn't answer at first. She just looked around, as if searching for some sign of life in the desolate streets. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the same grim resolve in her gaze. I don't know, she said quietly. But we have to keep moving. Maybe we'll find a way. Maybe we'll find other survivors. But you have to understand, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, there's no escaping the truth now. The dead are here to stay. And we're just waiting for our turn. I felt a chill run down my spine as the weight of her words settled in. I had tried to fight this nightmare, to escape it, but it was clear now. The dead were no longer confined to the cemetery. They had claimed the city, and now the living were left to wander in their wake, hopeless and alone. I followed them silently, moving deeper into the labyrinth of alleys and side streets, knowing that no matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we tried, the city was slowly dying around us. The undead were closing in, and we were just waiting for our turn to become part of the nightmare. And there was nothing we could do to stop it. There was no other choice. As much as my mind screamed at me to run, no matter how my heart pounded with the weight of what lay ahead, I knew deep down that I couldn't keep fleeing forever. The city had become a death trap, and the only way to stop this nightmare, to end the horror that had consumed New Orleans, was to confront it at its source. I turned to the man and woman, both of them eyeing me with uncertainty as I spoke, my voice firm but filled with a desperation I could no longer hide. I'm going back to the cemetery, I said, forcing myself to sound resolute. I have to. I can't just keep running. If I end this, maybe this city will stop falling apart. The woman's face hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making a mistake. No one who goes back there ever comes out. The ritual, it's too powerful now. You're just walking into their trap. I don't care, I snapped, the words escaping before I could think. I'm not going to just wait for them to come for me. If I can stop whatever it is that's causing this, whatever evil is pulling the strings, maybe we can still save what's left of this place." The man shook his head, looking away. "You don't understand. The dead, they're not just here because of some ritual. They're here because this land is cursed. The cemetery was built over something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. It's beyond our control now." I didn't want to hear any more of their warnings. I'd already made up my mind. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt the creeping dread of the undead growing around me. If I was going to make it out, if any of us had a chance, I needed to do something drastic. I had to go back to the cemetery. I had to stop whatever was driving this madness. "I'm going," I said again, this time quieter, my determination hardening like a stone in my chest. "You can stay here if you want, but I'm not running anymore." The woman studied me for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and something darker. Finally, she sighed and nodded, her face drawn with resignation. "Fine. Go," she muttered. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Without another word, I turned away and headed toward the streets, where the distant groans and growls of the undead filled the air like a constant, maddening soundtrack. Every step I took seemed to echo in my mind, a reminder of the perilous journey I had chosen. But I couldn't turn back now. Not when the fate of the city, of everything, was hanging by a thread. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way toward the cemetery, the sounds of the dead growing louder with each passing step. It was as if the city itself knew what I was about to do, knew that I was walking straight into the heart of the nightmare. But I pushed the fear aside, focusing only on the one goal I had left, stopping the ritual. As I reached the outskirts of the cemetery, the once familiar sight of the wrought iron gates now felt like a grim portal into hell. I could hear the soft shuffling of the undead moving between the graves, their hollow moans floating on the wind. The cemetery was alive with a malignant energy, and it made my skin crawl. I stepped through the gates, my breath catching in my throat as I looked out across the tombstones. The night was thick with fog, the air heavy and damp. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. I could feel the eyes of the dead on me, watching from the darkness as I ventured deeper into the heart of the cemetery. The air grew colder the further I went, and I could feel something shifting, something unnatural, just beneath the surface. It was like walking into the very bones of the city, a place where the living and the dead were no longer separate. As I moved past the rows of graves, I began to hear the faintest whispers, voices calling from the shadows. The ritual was close. I could feel it. I reached the center of the cemetery where the strange stone altar stood, its surface slick with age and wear. The ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with energy, as if something ancient and powerful was stirring beneath it. I crouched down and placed my hand on the stone, feeling its coldness seep into my skin. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear the soft rustling of movement behind me, though no one was there. But I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as a figure emerged from the darkness. The tall, hooded form moved silently toward me, its steps unnaturally smooth, as if it floated rather than walked. As it neared, I could make out the hollow, empty gaze at its face, the skin stretched tight across its skull. It was one of them, one of the undead, a mere shell of a person, but its presence radiated power, a twisted authority that chilled me to the bone. It raised a hand, pointing toward the altar. The message was clear. I was too late. The ritual was already in motion. I backed away, fear gripping my chest as the figure raised its other hand and whispered something in a language I couldn't understand. The ground rumbled, and I could feel the air around me crackle with energy. The undead, thousands of them, were rising from their graves, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. I had thought I could stop this. I had believed that if I confronted the source of the evil, I could end it. But now, standing in the midst of the rising dead, I realized that I had only walked right into the heart of the storm. The dead were here to stay, and I had become part of their curse. The city of New Orleans had become a prison, its streets now a labyrinth of empty buildings and decaying remnants of a once vibrant world. Every corner I turned, every shadow I passed, I could feel the weight of the undead creeping closer. The horrors of the cemetery, the rising dead, the ritual, the terrifying figure that had cornered me were all I could think about as I made my way back there. I told myself I had no other choice. I had to stop it. I had to stop whatever was pulling the strings of this nightmare, whatever cursed the ground beneath our feet and caused the dead to rise from their graves. The fear gnawed at me, but there was no escape anymore. The cemetery was the heart of it all. If I didn't face whatever awaited me there, then there would be no end to the chaos, to the endless hordes. I stepped through the familiar gates once more, and it was worse than I could have imagined. The air was still. Too still. The usual whispers of the wind had died, leaving behind an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on my chest. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the suffocating, dead weight of something ancient, something malevolent, filling the space. The cemetery had changed. Where once there had been a sense of haunted tranquility, there was now a thick, stifling presence. The graves were disturbed, the tombstones cracked and leaning at unnatural angles. But the most unsettling thing was the absence of sound. Where were the moans? The groans of the undead, the shuffle of their feet as they dragged their broken bodies from their graves? It was as if the cemetery had swallowed every trace of life, every trace of death, too. I stepped further into the graveyard, my feet crunching softly on the gravel path, the only noise in the stillness. I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything. But there was only silence, and the feeling that I was being watched. Then, as if summoned by my fear, the first movement caught my eye. A figure, slow, unsteady, but unmistakable, rose from one of the nearby graves. I froze. Its clothes were ragged, torn by the claws of the earth, and its skin hung loose from its bones like tattered cloth. It turned its hollow eyes toward me, and I felt the weight of its gaze deep in my chest. More followed. One by one, the dead began to rise. It was as though the ground itself had given them life, and now they were flooding the cemetery, silent, unstoppable, a tidal wave of the undead. Their eyes were lifeless, their mouths slack and hollow, but there was something different about them now. They moved with purpose, not the stumbling, mindless chaos of earlier. They were organized, as if they had a mission. And then I understood. The ritual, whatever it was, had gone far beyond what I had seen before. These weren't just the reanimated corpses of the cemetery, these were the summoned. The dead had been called forth, not to wander aimlessly, but to obey, to follow some dark will. And now, that will was focused on me. I couldn't move. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to flee as fast as I could. But there was no escape. The cemetery was overrun. The city was overrun. There was no place left to hide. As I stood there, paralyzed by terror, the dead slowly closed in, their decayed forms creeping toward me with purpose. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered. I had nothing left. Nothing but the knowledge that this was the end. And then, in the deepest pit of my fear, I heard it. The voice, low, guttural, yet distinct, whispering through the dead silence. Join us. It wasn't one voice, but 100, 1,000. The voices of the dead rising together, merging into one twisted sound. The dead spoke to me not with words, but with the promise of something darker, something inevitable. I took a step back, and then another, but the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever. I was cornered. I was trapped. And the only choice I had now was to fight or to die. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't escape. But maybe I could make one last stand. My hands trembled as I looked around for something, anything, that could help me. But there was nothing. Just the endless rows of graves, the decaying tombstones, and the rising dead. And then, a thought. A glimmer of hope, or maybe it was desperation. I remembered the altar. The ritual. The energy that had pulled the dead from their graves. Maybe, just maybe, if I could get to it, if I could destroy whatever remained of the ritual's power, I could stop them. But how? How could I fight the dead when they had already risen, when their numbers were endless? How could I face the force that had brought them back? The answer was clear. I couldn't. Not alone. But I had to try. I could feel the weight of the dead pressing in around me. Their hollow eyes never left mine as they slowly advanced, one step at a time. The silence, thick and suffocating, wrapped around me like a noose. My heart pounded in my chest, and every breath felt like it might be my last. But then, something shifted. A faint draft of air, cooler than the stillness around me, brushed my skin. My instinct screamed at me to run, to turn back, but I couldn't. Not now. There had to be something here, something that could stop this madness. The altar. I'd heard the locals whisper about it, seen it in passing during my earlier visits. But now, the thought of it was a lifeline, a thread to cling to in the chaos. If the ritual had begun here, it could also be undone here. The idea that I might be able to stop it, that there was something in the heart of the cemetery that could sever the grip the dead had on this land, ignited a spark of hope. I turned away from the advancing horde of undead and made my way through the graveyard. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but I forced myself to push forward, knowing I couldn't afford to hesitate. The silence grew louder in my ears, the only sound the scrape of my boots against the gravel path. It didn't take long to find it. The entrance was hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown vines, almost as if the cemetery itself was trying to keep its secrets buried. A small stone doorway, barely visible beneath the twisted roots, stood before me. I hesitated, fear clawing at my throat. But there was no choice. I had to go in. I pulled at the vines with shaking hands, my breath coming faster, heart racing as the dead pressed closer. I could hear them, now, shuffling, the unmistakable moans of the undead growing louder, the sound of their broken feet dragging through the dirt. They were closing in. With one last heave, I cleared the vines and forced the stone door open. The smell of damp earth and ancient stone filled my nose as I stepped into the darkness. I didn't know what I expected. But the chamber before me was nothing like I'd imagined. It was a hollow space beneath the cemetery, a cavern that stretched far deeper than I could have guessed. The walls were slick with moss, but in the center of the room, illuminated by the dim light that filtered through cracks in the stone, was the altar. A large stone structure, dark and weathered, stood at the center of the chamber. It was carved with intricate, ancient symbols, markings that twisted and spiraled in ways that made my head spin. Some of them looked familiar, others unfamiliar, but all of them pulsed with a strange, unsettling energy that sent shivers crawling up my spine. I stepped closer, drawn by the energy in the air, the same oppressive weight that had followed me throughout my time in the cemetery. The altar was stone, cold and unyielding beneath my fingertips as I traced the symbols carved into its surface. But as I touched the stone, a strange sensation gripped me. It was as though the air around me thickened, as though the ground beneath me had become alive, shifting and breathing. I pulled my hand away, heart racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was feeling. Then I saw it. In the center of the altar, etched deeply into the stone, was a single symbol that seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow, a mark I had seen before. The same symbol the locals had whispered about. The one tied to the ancient rituals, to the curse that had brought the dead to life. I stepped back, my mind reeling. This was it. This was the source of it all. The ritual, the power, the undead, it was all tied to this altar. The ritual had been performed here, and somehow, the energy had seeped into the land itself. I could hear the shuffling of feet again, the moans growing louder, closer. I could feel them coming, the undead closing in on this hidden chamber. I didn't have much time. A desperate thought crossed my mind. Could I destroy the altar? Could I break the curse that had twisted this place into something unnatural? I knew it wouldn't be easy. The symbols etched into the stone were ancient, tied to something far older than I could comprehend. But if I didn't try, if I didn't destroy this altar, then the undead would continue to rise, the dead would walk the earth forever, and New Orleans would be swallowed whole by the darkness. I took a step back, gathering my courage. There had to be a way. There had to be some way to stop this. I didn't know what kind of power was required to undo a ritual of this magnitude, but I had to find it. I searched the chamber frantically, eyes scanning for something, anything, that might help me. And then, I saw it. A small, withered book resting on a pedestal near the altar. It was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, but it was the only thing in the room that seemed to hold any answers. I grabbed it, the ancient leather of the book creaking in my hands as I flipped it open. The language was foreign, the writing barely legible, but something caught my eye, something that stood out against the rest of the pages. A ritual. A ritual that could reverse the power binding the dead to this place. I couldn't read it all, but I saw enough. Enough to know that it was my only hope. I set the book down, readying myself for what came next. The zombies were almost upon me. I could hear them now, moaning, dragging themselves closer, their feet scraping the stone. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I had to act fast. With one final look at the altar, I stepped forward, heart pounding, and prepared to do whatever it took to end the nightmare once and for all. As I stood before the altar, the weight of the ritual book heavy in my hands, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the chill that had grown colder with every passing second, nor the rustling of the graveyard's deathly inhabitants drawing near. It was something darker, something far older, awakening beneath the very ground I stood on. The air thickened, and with it, a low hum began to vibrate through the stone beneath my feet. I glanced around, the growing sense of dread pressing down on me as if the world itself was holding its breath. I could feel it, someone, or something, was watching me. Then, I heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Not from the zombies. I spun, heart in my throat, as a figure emerged from the shadows of the chamber. Tall and imposing, cloaked in darkness, the figure moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a man, or whatever it was. I couldn't see its face, obscured beneath the hood of a tattered robe, but I could feel the overwhelming power emanating from the figure. It was as if the very air trembled in its presence. I stumbled back, instinctively clutching the ritual book to my chest, but the figure didn't approach. Instead, it paused, a dark silhouette in the gloom, its presence like a suffocating weight pressing down on me. "You shouldn't have come here," a deep, cold voice rumbled from beneath the hood, each word carrying an unnatural resonance. The voice seemed to echo in my mind, sending shivers down my spine. I wanted to speak, to demand who they were, what they wanted, but the words died in my throat. My mouth was dry, my heart racing in my chest as the figure's gaze, though hidden, seemed to pierce right through me. "I am the one who controls the dead," the voice continued, colder than the grave itself. "The one who has kept them bound for centuries. And now, you threaten everything." The weight of their words crushed me. The mastermind behind it all. The one who had been summoning the dead, binding their souls to the earth, using the power of the cemetery to fuel their control. I felt a sickening realization dawn upon me. This wasn't just some isolated occurrence. This figure was ancient, powerful, and had been toying with the very forces of life and death for far longer than I could comprehend. But the question burned in my mind: why? Why are you doing this? I finally managed to force out, my voice shaky but defiant. Why raise the dead? Why torment the living? The figure's head tilted slightly, as if contemplating my question, before a dark chuckle filled the chamber. It was soft at first, like the wind whistling through the trees, but it grew louder, more chilling. "Torment?" the figure asked. "You call it torment?" "No, child. It is power. Power beyond your understanding. The dead are merely tools, soldiers in my army, instruments of my will. I have waited for centuries, hidden in the shadows, manipulating the forces of life and death, binding them to my control." The figure's voice grew more commanding, each word like a death knell. "And now, you come here, seeking to undo what has taken so long to build." I could feel the weight of their words pressing on me. I wanted to run, to flee from this place, but my legs felt like stone, frozen in place. This wasn't just a man, or even a mortal being. This was something ancient, a creature that had defied time itself. "You think you can stop me?" the figure asked, their voice growing louder, more confident. "The dead will always rise. They will follow my command. The power I control is limitless. You have no idea what you're up against. I didn't know how to fight this. How could I fight something so old, so powerful?" But the book in my hands pulsed with a strange energy. The symbols on its pages seemed to glow faintly, as though they were responding to the figure's presence. In that moment, I realized the truth. The ritual that had bound the dead to this place was not just for summoning them, it was a tether, a link between the living and the dead, one that could be severed. But I needed to act quickly. The figure before me, the dark being who controlled the dead, would not allow me to succeed without a fight. "You cannot stop me," the figure repeated, a final warning before they took a step forward, their presence growing stronger, darker. The ground beneath my feet trembled as if the earth itself was shaking in fear. The zombies were closing in outside, their unholy groans and dragging footsteps growing louder with every passing second. Time was running out. I could feel it in my bones. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I gripped the book tighter, my mind racing for a way out. My eyes darted back to the altar, the strange symbols glowing brighter now. I had one chance, one final hope, to use the ritual to undo what the figure had wrought. The power to stop the dead, to sever the control that had tied them to this world, was within my reach. But it meant confronting the mastermind directly. With a deep breath, I stood my ground. "I will stop you," I said, the words ringing louder than I felt. You cannot control the dead forever. The figure's laughter was cold and mocking. You think you can challenge me? You are nothing but a fleeting shadow, a tiny spark in the darkness. The dead are mine to command, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. I didn't have time for fear. The moment was now. With everything I had, I raised the book above my head and shouted the incantation, praying that I had deciphered it correctly. The words that flowed from my lips weren't mine. They were ancient, powerful, and laced with an energy that made the air crackle. The ground shook, and the altar trembled as though it was alive. And then, everything went silent. The air was thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on me as the figure before me stood unyielding, its dark presence consuming the chamber. The altar trembled beneath the echoes of the incantation I had just unleashed, but the dark figure only laughed, a sound that scraped against my mind like nails on glass. You are foolish, the figure's voice boomed, growing louder, deeper. It was no longer just a voice, it was a storm inside my skull, a force that threatened to shatter my sanity. You cannot stop what has already begun. The dead cannot be undone. I have risen them from the earth, and they are mine. I shook my head, trying to dispel the crushing weight of despair that seemed to flood my chest. My mind was racing, but it was like trying to swim in a storm. Every thought was overwhelmed by the relentless tide of fear. The book still burned in my hands, its pages glowing faintly, offering the slightest glimmer of hope, but it was hard to see it, hard to trust it, amidst the nightmare unfolding before me. The figure took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble with its every movement. I felt my knees weaken beneath me, a wave of vertigo threatening to pull me into the depths of the horror surrounding us. But I couldn't let it, no matter how terrifying, no matter how impossible it seemed. This was my only chance. You think you can challenge me? The figure sneered, stepping closer. You are nothing. A lost soul, stumbling into a world that you cannot comprehend. The dead are mine, and they will follow my every command. You will be swallowed by this place, and soon even you will rise. I could see it in the shadows behind the figure, eyes glowing faintly, figures stirring in the darkness, the unmistakable shapes of the dead moving closer with each passing second. They were coming. They were always coming. I forced myself to stand, clutching the book with both hands. The symbols seemed to pulse against my fingers, urging me forward, guiding me towards something I couldn't yet understand. The ritual was still incomplete. There was something I had missed, something I had to finish, a way to break the hold this dark figure had over the dead. The figure raised its hand, and I felt the air grow colder, suffocatingly cold. I gasped for breath, but it felt like my lungs were being crushed. The force of its presence was overpowering, each breath a struggle against the rising tide of darkness. You are weak, the figure hissed. You cannot fight what you cannot see, what you do not understand. The dead are mine to command. And soon, you will be too. I opened my mouth to scream, to tell it that I wouldn't give up, that I wouldn't let it win, but the words choked in my throat. A wave of dizziness hit me, my vision blurring, and for a moment, I felt my knees buckle. I was falling. But then, through the fog of terror and confusion, something shifted. The symbols in the book flared brightly, and the energy inside me surged. I gripped the book tighter, focusing on the incantation, on the power that I had to channel. The figure before me, towering and overwhelming, began to flicker. Its edges seemed to blur and distort, like a shadow struggling to maintain its shape. You can't, the figure growled, its voice now straining with rage. This power is beyond you. But I felt it now, the pull of the ritual, the force that had been building all along. The dead were not just rising, they were being controlled. And the key to stopping them was right here, in my hands. With one final, desperate cry, I thrust the book forward, the words spilling from my lips faster than I could control them, the ancient incantation pouring out like a torrent. The air around us crackled, the ground shaking violently as the dark figure staggered back, a look of shock and fury crossing its distorted face. "No!" it screamed, a screeching sound that pierced my eardrums, a raw, primal noise that made my blood run cold. "You cannot undo what I have done." But it was too late. The earth itself seemed to tremble in response to the power I had unleashed, and a brilliant light flooded the chamber. The shadows around the figure twisted and writhed, the very fabric of reality cracking under the intensity of the ritual. The dark figure screamed again, but this time it was a sound of pure terror. I couldn't look away. My hand shook violently as the light grew brighter, blinding me. The book burned hot against my palms, the pages glowing so fiercely it was as if they were about to catch fire. My mind reeled from the intensity of the energy, but I kept my focus, kept repeating the incantation. And then, with a deafening roar, the figure began to crumble. It wasn't a collapse of flesh or bone, no, it was something worse. The figure fractured into thousands of shards of darkness, each piece fading into the air like smoke, as if the very essence of its being was being torn apart, unraveling at the seams. The chamber shuddered with the force of the destruction, and I stumbled back, blinded by the light and nearly losing my balance. The air was thick with the lingering echoes of the ritual, the oppressive weight that had filled the chamber dissipating like fog in the morning sun. The dark figure was gone, but the victory was hollow. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The earth no longer trembled, but the weight of the moment settled heavily on my chest. The air felt wrong, like it had been tainted by the dark force that had once controlled the dead. My breath came in ragged gasps as I struggled to regain my bearings. The ground beneath me seemed to stir. It wasn't over yet. The undead were still out there. And as I turned toward the cemetery's exit, I realized the truth: nothing was ever truly gone. The shadows would always linger, the dead would always rise, and the darkness would always find a way to return. I had only delayed the inevitable. The ritual ended in a violent explosion of light, a burst of energy that knocked me off my feet, slamming my body into the cold, damp earth. My head spun, the world around me blurring as the remnants of the dark figure crumbled into nothingness. The air crackled with the last remnants of dark magic, fading like the dying echoes of a terrible nightmare. For a moment, all was silent, eerily silent. I gasped for breath, the pressure in my chest lifting slightly, the sense of suffocation fading. The overwhelming weight of the curse seemed to ease, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to believe that I had succeeded. But as I pushed myself to my feet, wiping dirt from my hands and face, the faintest sounds began to reach my ears, soft, insistent, like distant whispers on the wind. Then, the ground beneath me trembled once more. I turned toward the source of the noise, my heart sinking into my stomach as the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The dead were still rising. The altar, which had once held the dark figure's power, now stood in ruins, but the earth around it was alive with movement. The graves that had been sealed for centuries cracked open, the soil shifting as if the dead were clawing their way out, reaching for the surface with desperate, rotten hands. The zombies, those foul creatures that had terrorized New Orleans, were still coming. "No, it can't be," I whispered hoarsely, my voice breaking. I had thought that by destroying the dark figure, the curse would be broken, that the dead would return to their graves, that New Orleans would be free from the horrific grip it had been under for so long. But it seemed that I had misunderstood everything. The ritual had been only a symptom, not the cause. The power that had been unleashed could not be undone. The curse had seeped into the very ground, the very soul of the city. It was not one figure that controlled the dead, it was the land itself. And the land had been corrupted long before I had arrived. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to grasp the full weight of the horror that was unfolding before me. The dark figure might have been destroyed, but the magic that had been unleashed was irreversible. The dead had already been summoned, and now they would continue to rise, as long as the curse persisted. I turned and ran, my legs weak beneath me, but I couldn't escape the truth. I couldn't outrun it. The sound of the undead rising, the sickening moans and growls echoing through the cemetery, filled the air behind me like a terrible, inescapable soundtrack. I made my way toward the cemetery gates, hoping, praying that I could escape. But as I passed through the gates and into the streets of New Orleans, the full extent of the nightmare became clear. The city was no longer the vibrant, colorful place I had first arrived in. It was a hollow shell, a city trapped in the grip of death. The streets, once bustling with life, were eerily empty. The shops and cafes sat abandoned, their windows shattered, their doors ajar. The sounds of the living had long since disappeared, replaced by the haunting moans of the undead, the shuffling footsteps of the risen dead that echoed through the alleys and narrow streets. I could hear the screams in the distance. The survivors, if there were any left, were hidden somewhere out of sight. But there was nowhere to hide. The dead were everywhere, their numbers growing with each passing hour. The curse had claimed the entire city. I found a small group of survivors, huddled together in a darkened alley. They looked at me with fear in their eyes, but there was also something else there, something that made me feel like an outsider, like someone who had already lost their soul to the city. They didn't speak to me, didn't offer any comfort. There was nothing left to say. I knew then New Orleans was lost. No one would ever leave. The curse could never be broken, and the dead would continue to rise until there was nothing left but the ruins of a city consumed by darkness. And as I looked up at the sky, thick with the swirling fog of an eternal night, I realized that no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried, the nightmare would follow me. It had already become a part of me, a curse that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had hope for an end, but there was no end. Only the dead. And they would never stop coming. The city of New Orleans had fallen. And with it, any hope that the curse could be undone. The shadows would always rise again, and the dead would always walk the streets, trapped in an endless, unholy cycle. The streets of New Orleans were silent, save for the soft shuffle of my own footsteps. I could hardly hear the sound over the roar of my thoughts, heavy, suffocating, each one more twisted than the last. The city that had once been full of life, filled with music and laughter, was now a barren wasteland. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and every corner I turned seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. I had survived. I was still breathing, still walking, but it didn't feel like living. How could it? What remained of me was just a shadow, a hollow version of the person I had once been. There was nothing left in me but the weight of the horror I had witnessed. The faces of the dead, their eyes, their soulless stares, their rotting flesh. They were etched into my mind, replaying on an endless loop. The curse had claimed the city, yes, but it had also claimed me. I was part of the nightmare now. My body moved on its own accord, taking me down streets I didn't remember walking down, past buildings that had once been familiar, now reduced to crumbling husks. The storefronts were abandoned, the windows shattered. The only signs of life were the occasional figure stumbling through the fog, more of the undead. They had taken over everything. There was nowhere left to hide, no place to run. I passed by a street corner where I had once seen a cafe, a place I had visited during my first days in the city. I had sat there, enjoying the vibrant energy of New Orleans, savoring the sounds of jazz spilling out of the open windows. The music, the laughter, the warmth of the city had felt like home. But now, all I saw were broken windows, the tables overturned, the chairs scattered in disarray. The spirit of the city was gone. I stopped for a moment, leaning against a wall to steady myself. The air was damp, cold even though it was still summer. The weight of everything was too much to bear, and I felt my legs give out beneath me. I sank to the ground, my head spinning. Had I really thought I could escape? That by confronting the dark figure in the cemetery, I could somehow end this nightmare? The truth was clear now. It wasn't one man, one being, or even a curse that had brought the dead to life. The land itself had been corrupted, soaked in something far older and darker than I could ever comprehend. And now, the dead were everywhere. I closed my eyes, but all I saw was the endless parade of decomposing bodies rising from their graves, their hollow eyes following me. The moaning, the shuffling footsteps, the grotesque, twisted figures, those images were burned into my soul like a brand that would never fade. A single tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. What good would it do? I wasn't crying for myself. I wasn't crying for the city. I was crying for the innocent lives that had been consumed by this curse, for the people who would never see the light of day again. I stood up slowly, my body aching from the weight of everything I had seen and done. There was no salvation for New Orleans, no hope for the city, no hope for me. We were both lost, forever. As I continued to walk, I knew I wasn't looking for a way out. There was no escape. The horror had already seeped into my bones, into my very being. I was as much a part of the curse as the city itself. There was no end to this nightmare. And so, I wandered. Through streets covered in fog, through buildings that no longer resembled what they once were, through a city full of the dead and the remnants of the living, I wandered. I would never be free. And neither would New Orleans. The undead were eternal. And so was my torment. I wandered through the empty streets for what felt like hours, the oppressive silence weighing on me, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. New Orleans, once a city of vibrant life, now felt like a tomb. The fog that blanketed the streets seemed to carry the smell of death, thick and suffocating. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, and the faint sound of distant moans, undead, still searching, echoed through the alleyways and across the desolate streets. I had no destination, no real purpose. My body moved by instinct now, dragging me along as if the very earth itself had decided I would not rest. There was no escaping the truth that this city, this place that had once felt alive with energy, was beyond saving. But I wasn't alone. As I turned a corner, I saw them, figures huddled together in the shadows of a broken building, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. Survivors, or what was left of them. I approached cautiously, each step hesitant, unsure of what kind of welcome I would receive. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in tattered clothing, their faces smeared with dirt, their hands clutching weapons they barely knew how to use. One of the men spotted me first, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of suspicion passing over his face. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his features drawn tight with fatigue. "You are them?" he asked, his voice rough, hoarse from disuse. I shook my head, raising my hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "No. I'm just trying to survive." For a moment, there was silence. The other two survivors regarded me with equal wariness. They seemed like they hadn't spoken to anyone else in days, maybe longer. The weight of solitude and fear was written all over their faces. It was as though hope had slipped away from them entirely, and in its place was nothing but the grim acceptance that death was inevitable. "We're all just trying to survive," the woman said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were vacant, as if she had long ago given up on the idea of escaping. I wanted to speak, to offer them some words of hope, but I knew there was none. The undead were everywhere. The city was lost. The curse had claimed not just the land, but the spirit of everyone who had once called it home. I could see it in their eyes, the same hollow look I had seen reflected in my own. "Is there anywhere safe?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was a stupid question, and I knew it. No place in New Orleans was safe anymore. The man who had first spoken to me laughed, if you could call it that. It was a hollow, humorless sound, like a rattling cough. "Safe? The only safe place left is death." His words hung in the air, suffocating the small flicker of hope I had been foolish enough to entertain. The survivors had already accepted it. They had stopped fighting. They had stopped caring. The woman, her shoulders slumped, looked at the ground, her hands trembling as she clutched a rusty knife. "We tried to escape," she murmured, almost to herself. "But every road leads back here. The dead, they're everywhere." I swallowed, trying to steady my breath, but the truth was clear now. They were wrong. There was no escape. The city had fallen. The dead had risen, and now they roamed freely, an unstoppable force of nature. No one had the strength to fight anymore, not the living, and not the survivors. They had already been consumed by fear, by the unrelenting reality of their situation. "Is there anything left to fight for?" I asked quietly, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. The man who had laughed earlier stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. "You should have asked that question before. Now, there's nothing left but waiting for the end." I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the air grew colder, heavier. We all stood there in the shadow of a once thriving city, a city that had been swallowed whole by death. The survivors had lost their will to fight, they had lost their will to live. And I couldn't blame them. I glanced at the three of them one last time, three souls who had once been full of life, now reduced to ghosts of their former selves. They would never leave. None of us would. Without a word, I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to do. The city was lost, and with it, any chance of escape. The undead had claimed everything, and the survivors had surrendered long ago. New Orleans had fallen. And with it, all hope. I thought I could escape. After all, what more was there to stay for? The city was a ghost town, the air thick with death. The survivors had given up, retreating into their own little pockets of despair, too broken to even try to fight. The zombies were everywhere, more of them rising from the graves every night, spilling out from the cemetery and creeping through every street, every building. It was only a matter of time before they came for all of us, one by one. But I couldn't stay. Not in a place so steeped in darkness, in the very air that seemed to crush the soul. I had to leave. I had to find a way out. So, I gathered whatever strength I had left and made my way to the edge of the city. The streets were quiet, eerily so. I could almost hear my own heartbeat, the pounding of blood in my ears. The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, and the shadows in every corner seemed to writhe. Still, I pressed on. I had no other choice. As I reached the outskirts, I could see the road stretching before me, the only clear path left. The thought of freedom, of escape, pulsed in my mind, pushing me forward, urging me to run faster. But as I took that first step toward the open road, I felt it. A cold, invisible pull, like 1,000 hands reaching out from the ground, gripping my very soul, holding me back. I stopped in my tracks, my chest tightening, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I turned around, and there they were, just beyond the mist, silhouettes rising from the ground, slow and lumbering. The undead. They were everywhere, moving like a slow tide, a relentless, unstoppable force. But they weren't the ones pulling me back. No, it was something else. I tried to take another step forward, but it felt as if the earth itself was refusing to let me go. My feet felt like they were stuck in thick mud, my body refusing to obey my commands. My heart raced, my mind spiraling into panic. I struggled, trying to move, to escape, but it was like I was tethered to the city by some unseen force. And then, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, as if the very ground was groaning under some ancient weight. The whispers, the moans, they were all around me, growing louder, closer. The dead were moving toward me, but that wasn't what terrified me most. It was the feeling of being watched, of something far more powerful than the zombies themselves having its eyes fixed on me. I looked around, searching for the source of that sensation, but there was nothing visible. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. The pressure, the force holding me in place, was suffocating. I could feel the pull, like a chain tightening around my chest, dragging me back toward the heart of the city, back toward the cemetery, back to the horror that had consumed everything. No matter how hard I fought, no matter how much I tried to move, my feet were glued to the ground. I was trapped. The city wasn't letting me go. I looked again at the road, my last chance at freedom, but it seemed so far away now, almost unreachable. The undead were closing in, their eyes glowing in the dark, their slow, dragging steps echoing through the fog. I could hear their groans, their moans, and yet something else, a strange, powerful force pulling me back into the depths of the city. It was as if the city itself was alive, its grip on me too strong to break. I had tried to leave, but it wasn't just the dead keeping me here, it was something more. Something ancient, something tied to this land. The curse was not just on the cemetery, but on the very ground I stood on. New Orleans was a prison, and I was its prisoner. I felt the pull again, stronger now. The earth beneath me trembled, as if urging me to turn back. My legs moved against my will, forcing me to walk toward the heart of the city once more. The dead were everywhere, and I was being drawn back to them. I tried to fight, to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The shadows grew longer, more oppressive. The city had claimed me, body and soul. And I knew then there was no leaving. Not for me. Not for anyone. New Orleans had swallowed us whole. And now there was no escape. I can't remember the last time I felt anything other than fear. Every waking moment is like a blur, my thoughts fractured and heavy. The city, it has a way of doing that to you. It twists you, breaks you down, until you're no longer the person you once were. I used to be someone else. I remember that person vaguely, someone with hope, with ambition. Someone who could laugh, who could dream of something better than this? But now I am a shell. A shadow. Just another lost soul wandering the streets of New Orleans, slowly becoming part of the horde that surrounds me. The truth is, I'm not even sure who I am anymore. The memories of my life before the cemetery, before the darkness began to seep into the very air of this place, feel like a distant dream. A memory that's slipping through my fingers, vanishing the moment I try to grasp it. I used to have a name, a purpose. But now, when I try to say it, it's like the words are unfamiliar, alien. The city has taken that from me, too, my identity, my soul. I look at my reflection in broken windows or the cracks of mirrors in abandoned houses, and I barely recognize the face staring back at me. The eyes are empty, hollow. They've seen too much, felt too much. There's nothing left. I wander the streets aimlessly, each step heavier than the last. The sound of my footsteps echoes in the empty streets, mingling with the moans of the dead. They follow me. I know they do. I can hear them, always just behind me, as if they're waiting for something. But it's not just the zombies that I fear. No, it's the city itself. I can feel it in the very air, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. It's like the land here is cursed, pulling at me, changing me. The longer I stay, the more I lose myself, until one day, I won't remember who I was before this nightmare began. I can't move forward. Every step I take feels like it's dragging me deeper into the abyss. I don't know where I'm going, or if I'll even get there. The city is like a maze, its streets shifting and changing, its buildings decaying around me. There's no way out. And deep down, I think I know that now. There never was. The fear is constant, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I can't escape it. I don't know how to anymore. I just keep walking, hoping for something, anything, that might end this. But the longer I move, the more I realize that there's no escape. There's nowhere left to run. The zombies are all around me, but I'm not sure if they're even the worst of it anymore. There's something else in this city. Something darker. Something that isn't alive, but isn't dead either. A presence. And I can feel it closing in on me, watching me from the shadows. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what's going to happen next. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never be the same. The city has claimed me, just like it's claimed everyone else who came here with a dream, with a hope, with a future. Now, I am just another lost soul. A hollow, broken thing. And I'll never escape. Because there is no escaping New Orleans. There is no escaping what it's become. And I am just one more shadow, lost in the dark. I don't know how much time has passed since I lost track of who I was. Days? Weeks? It doesn't matter. Time is a concept that no longer has meaning here. The fog, the shadows, the constant groaning of the dead, it all blurs together, drowning out everything else. I feel it now, the change. It's slow at first, barely noticeable. A chill in my bones that doesn't go away, no matter how much I try to warm myself. A numbness that spreads through my limbs, dulling the pain but also the feeling of being alive. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion. Maybe I was just losing my mind, as I'd feared from the beginning. But now, I know the truth. I can feel it in the way my body moves, the stiffness that wasn't there before. The hunger that gnaws at my insides, a thirst for something I can't quite name. My thoughts are growing slower, more fragmented. I try to remember the last time I felt human, but the memories slip away like sand through my fingers. What did it feel like to truly be alive? I try to call out, to scream, but the words get caught in my throat, just like the others who've been swallowed by this city. The words are meaningless now. The terror is meaningless. Because I know deep down that the end has come for me. I turn my gaze toward the horizon, toward the city that has consumed me, body and soul. The streets are silent, but the feeling of being watched is always there. The undead shuffle along the streets, their hollow eyes staring into the nothingness. They don't care anymore. They are part of the city now, as much a fixture of New Orleans as the crumbling buildings and the rotting streets. And now, I am one of them. My body moves without my consent, stumbling like those I once feared, driven by the same hunger, the same unholy need to feed. The curse has finally claimed me. I can feel it, my skin growing cold, my heart no longer beating in time with the world around me. I am dead. And yet, I am still here. It's funny, really. All this time, I thought I could escape. I thought that maybe I could outrun it, find a way out. But now, as I stand in the street, among the fallen, I realize there's no escape. Not for anyone. The curse of New Orleans is endless. It consumes you, body and soul, until you become just another part of its twisted cycle. And when you think you've finally given up hope, when you think you're free, you realize that you never were. The dead keep rising. The city keeps feeding on the living. And the cycle continues. As I shuffle into the ranks of the undead, I know my fate is sealed. I am now just one more lost soul, wandering the streets, lost to the world. Just another shadow of the past, waiting for the next fool to wander into the city's grasp. And when they do, when they fall victim to the same curse that claimed me, they'll understand. There is no escape from New Orleans. There never was. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.